Chapter 13. Tom's mind was made up now. He was gloomy and desperate. He was a forsaken, friendless boy, he said. Nobody loved him. When they found out what they had driven him to, perhaps they would be sorry. He had tried to do right and get along, but they would not let him, since nothing would do them but to be rid of him. Let it be so, and let them blame him for the consequences. Why shouldn't they? What right had the friendless to complain? Yes, they had forced him to it at last. He would lead a life of crime. There was no choice. By this time he was far down Meadow Lane, and the bell for school to take up tinkled faintly upon his ear. He sobbed. Now, to think he should never hear that old familiar sound any more. It was very hard, but it was forced on him. Since he was driven out into the cold world, he must submit, but he forgave them. Then the sobs came thick and fast. Just at this point he met his soul's sworn comrade, Joe Harper, hard-eyed, and with evidently a great and dismal purpose in his heart. Plainly here were two souls with but a single thought. Tom, wiping his eyes with his sleeve, began to blubber out something about a resolution to escape from hard usage and lack of sympathy at home by roaming abroad into the great world never to return, and ended by hoping that Joe would not forget him. But it transpired that this was a request which Joe had just been going to make of Tom, and had come to hunt him up for that purpose. His mother had whipped him for drinking some cream which he had never tasted and knew nothing about. It was plain that she was tired of him, and wished him to go. If she felt that way, there was nothing for him to do but succumb. He hoped she would be happy, and never regret having driven her poor boy out into the unfeeling world to suffer and die. As the two boys walked sorrowing along, they made a new compact to stand by each other and be brothers and never separate till death relieved them of their troubles. Then they began to lay their plans. Joe was for being a hermit and living on crusts in a remote cave and dying sometime of cold and want and grief. But after listening to Tom, he conceded that there were some conspicuous advantages about a life of crime, and so he consented to be a pirate. 3 miles below St. Petersburg, at a point where the Mississippi River was a trifle over a mile wide, there was a long, narrow, wooded island with a shallow bar at the head of it, and this offered well as a rendezvous. It was not inhabited. It lay far over toward the further shore, abreast a dense and almost wholly unpeopled forest. So Jackson's Island was chosen. Who were to be the subjects of their piracies was a matter that did not occur to them. Then they hunted up Huckleberry Finn, and he joined them promptly, for all careers were one to him. He was indifferent. They soon separated to meet at a lonely spot on the river bank 2 miles above the village at the favorite hour, which was midnight. There was a small log raft there which they meant to capture. Each would bring hooks and lines and such provision as he could steal in the most dark and mysterious way as became outlaws. And before the afternoon was done, they had all managed to enjoy the sweet glory of spreading the fact that pretty soon the town would hear something. All who got this vague hint were cautioned to be mum and wait. About midnight Tom arrived with a boiled ham and a few trifles, and stopped in a dense undergrowth on a small bluff overlooking the meeting place. It was starlight and very still. The mighty river lay like an ocean at rest. Tom listened a moment, but no sound disturbed the quiet. Then he gave a low, distinct whistle. It was answered from under the bluff. Tom whistled twice more. These signals were answered in the same way. Then a guarded voice said, "Who goes there?" "Tom Sawyer, the Black Avenger of the Spanish Main." "Name your names." "Huck Finn the Red-Handed, and Joe Harper the Terror of the Seas." Tom had furnished these titles from his favorite literature. "It is well. Give the countersign." Two hoarse whispers delivered the same awful words simultaneously to the brooding night. "Blood." Then Tom tumbled his ham over the bluff, and let himself down after it, tearing both skin and clothes to some extent in the effort. There was an easy, comfortable path along the shore under the bluff, but it lacked the advantages of difficulty and danger so valued by a pirate. The terror of the seas had brought a side of bacon and had about worn himself out with getting it there. Finn the red-handed had stolen a skillet and a quantity of half-cured leaf tobacco, and had also brought a few corn cobs to make pipes with, but none of the pirates smoked or chewed but himself. The Black Avenger of the Spanish Main said it would never do to start without some fire. That was a wise thought. Matches were hardly known therein that day. They saw a fire smoldering upon a great raft 100 yards above, and they went stealthily there and helped themselves to a chunk. They made an imposing adventure of it, saying, hissed, every now and then, and suddenly halting with finger on lip, moving with hands on imaginary dagger hilts, and giving orders in dismal whispers that if the foe stirred, to let him have it to the hilt, because dead men tell no tales. They knew well enough that the raftsmen were all down at the village laying in stores or having a spree, but still that was no excuse for their conducting this thing in an unpiratical way. They shoved off soon, Tom in command, Huck at the after oar and Joe at the forward. Tom stood amidships, gloomy-browed and with folded arms, and gave his orders in a low, stern whisper. Luff, and bring her to the wind. Aye, aye, sir. Steady, steady, why. Steady it is, sir. Let her go off a point. Point it is, sir. As the boys steadily and monotonously drove the raft toward a midstream, it was no doubt understood that these orders were given only for style, and were not intended to mean anything in particular. What sail's she carrying? Courses, topsails, and flying jib, sir. Send the Ariels up, lay out aloft. There, half a dozen of ye, for topmast stunsail. Lively, now. Aye, aye, sir. Shake out that maint'gallantsail. Sheets and braces. Now, my hearties. Aye, aye, sir. Helm a lee. Hard a port. Stand by to meet her when she comes. Port, port. Now, men, with a will. Sev why. Steady it is, sir. The raft drew beyond the middle of the river. The boys pointed her head right and then lay on their oars. The river was not high, so there was not more than a 2 or 3 mile current. Hardly a word was said during the next 3/4 of an hour. Now the raft was passing before the distant town. 2 or 3 glimmering lights showed where it lay, peacefully sleeping beyond the vague vast sweep of star-gemmed water, unconscious of the tremendous event that was happening. The Black Avenger stood still with folded arms, looking his last upon the scene of his former joys and his later sufferings, and wishing she could see him now, abroad on the wild sea, facing peril and death, with dauntless heart, going to his doom with a grim smile on his lips. It was but a small strain on his imagination to remove Jackson's Island beyond eyeshot of the village, and so he looked his last with a broken and satisfied heart. The other pirates were looking their last, too, and they all looked so long that they came near letting the current drift them out of the range of the island. But they discovered the danger in time and made shift to avert it. About 2 o'clock in the morning the raft grounded on the bar 200 yards above the head of the island, and they waded back and forth until they had landed. Their freight, part of the little raft's belongings, consisted of an old sail, and this they spread over a nook in the bushes for a tent to shelter their provisions, but they themselves would sleep in the open air in good weather as became outlaws. They built a fire against the side of a great log 20 or 30 steps within the somber depths of the forest, and then cooked some bacon in the frying pan for supper and used up half of the corn pone stock they had brought. It seemed glorious sport to be feasting in that wild, free way in the virgin forest of an unexplored and uninhabited island, far from the haunts of men, and they said they never would return to civilization. The climbing fire lit up their faces and threw its ruddy glare upon the pillared tree trunks of their forest temple and upon the varnished foliage and festooning vines. When the last crisp slice of bacon was gone and the last allowance of corn pone devoured, the boys stretched themselves out on the grass, filled with contentment. They could have found a cooler place, but they would not deny themselves such a romantic feature as the roasting campfire. "Ain't it gay?" said Joe. "It's nuts," said Tom. "What would the boys say if they could see us?" "Say? Well, they'd just die to be here, hey, Huggy?" "I reckon so," said Huckleberry. "Anyways, I'm suited. I don't want nothing better'n this. I don't ever get enough to eat, generally, and here they can't come and pick at a feller and bullyrag him so. It's just the life for me," said Tom. "You don't have to get up mornings, and you don't have to go to school, and wash, and all that. Blame foolishness. You see, a pirate don't have to do anything, Joe, when he's ashore, but a hermit he has to be praying considerable, and then he don't have any fun, anyway, all by himself that way." "Oh yes, that's so," said Joe, "but I hadn't thought much about it, you know. I'd a good deal rather be a pirate, now that I've tried it. You see," said Tom, "people don't go much on hermits nowadays, like they used to in old times, but a pirate's always respected. And a hermit's got to sleep on the hardest place he can find, and put sackcloth and ashes on his head, and stand out in the rain, and—" "What does he put sackcloth and ashes on his head for?" inquired Huck. "I dunno, but they've got to do it. Hermits always do. You'd have to do that if you was a hermit." "Derned if I would," said Huck. "Well, what would you do?" "I dunno, but I wouldn't do that." "Why, Huck, you'd have to. How'd you get around it?" "Why, I just wouldn't stand it. I'd run away." "Run away? Well, you would be a nice old slouch of a hermit. You'd be a disgrace." The red-handed made no response, being better employed. He had finished gouging out a cob, and now he fitted a weed stem to it, loaded it with tobacco, and was pressing a coal to the charge and blowing a cloud of fragrant smoke. He was in the full bloom of luxurious contentment. The other pirates envied him this majestic vice, and secretly resolved to acquire it shortly. Soon Huck said, "What does pirates have to do?" Tom said, "Oh, they have just a bully time. Take ships and burn them, and get the money and bury it in awful places in their island where there's ghosts and things to watch it, and kill everybody in the ships, make 'em walk a plank, and they carry the women to the island," said Joe. "They don't kill the women." "No," assented Tom, "they don't kill the women. They're too noble. And the women's always beautiful, too. And don't they wear the bullest clothes?" "Oh no, all gold and silver and diamonds," said Joe with enthusiasm. "Who?" said Huck. "Why, the pirates." Huck scanned his own clothing forlornly. "I reckon I ain't dressed fittin' for a pirate," said he, with a regretful pathos in his voice, "but I ain't got none but these." But the other boys told him the fine clothes would come fast enough, after they should have begun their adventures. They made him understand that his poor rags would do to begin with, though it was customary for wealthy pirates to start with a proper wardrobe. Gradually their talk died out, and drowsiness began to steal upon the eyelids of the little waifs. The pipe dropped from the fingers of the red-handed, and he slept the sleep of the conscience-free and the weary. The terror of the seas and the black avenger of the Spanish Main had more difficulty in getting to sleep. They said their prayers inwardly and lying down, since there was nobody there with authority to make them kneel and recite aloud. In truth, they had a mind not to say them at all, but they were afraid to proceed to such lengths as that, lest they may call down a sudden and special thunderbolt from heaven. Then at once they reached and hovered upon the imminent verge of sleep, but an intruder came, now, that would not down. It was conscience. They began to feel a vague fear that they had been doing wrong to run away, and next they thought of the stolen meat, and then the real torture came. They tried to argue it away by reminding conscience that they had purloined sweetmeats and apples scores of times, but conscience was not to be appeased by such thin plausibilities. It seemed to them, in the end, that there was no getting around the stubborn fact that taking sweetmeats was only hooking, while taking bacon and hams and such valuables was plain, simple stealing, and there was a command against that in the Bible. So, they inwardly resolved that so long as they remained in the business, their piracies should not again be sullied with the crime of stealing. Chapter 14. When Tom awoke in the morning, he wondered where he was. He sat up and rubbed his eyes and looked around. Then he comprehended. It was the cool gray dawn, and there was a delicious sense of repose and peace in the deep pervading calm and silence of the woods. Not a leaf stirred, not a sound obtruded upon great nature's meditation. Beaded dewdrops stood upon the leaves and grasses. A white layer of ashes covered the fire, and a thin blue breath of smoke rose straight into the air. Joe and Huck still slept. Now, far away in the woods, a bird called. Another answered. Soon, the hammering of a woodpecker was heard. Gradually, the cool, dim gray of the morning whitened, and as gradually sounds multiplied and life manifested itself. The marvel of nature shaking off sleep and going to work unfolded itself to the musing boy. A little green worm came crawling over a dewy leaf, lifting 2/3 of his body into the air from time to time and sniffing around, then proceeding again, for he was measuring, Tom said, and when the worm approached him of its own accord, he sat as still as a stone, with his hopes rising and falling by turns as the creature still came toward him or seemed inclined to go elsewhere, and when at last it considered a painful moment with its curved body in the air and then came decisively down upon Tom's leg and began a journey over him, his whole heart was glad, for that meant that he was going to have a new suit of clothes, without the shadow of a doubt, a gaudy piratical uniform. Now a procession of ants appeared, from nowhere in particular, and went about their labors. One struggled manfully by with a dead spider 5 times as big as itself in its arms, and lugged it straight up a tree trunk. A brown spotted ladybug climbed the dizzy height of a grass blade, and Tom bent down close to it and said, "Ladybug, Ladybug, fly away home. Your house is on fire, your children's alone," and she took wing and went off to see about it, which did not surprise the boy, for he knew of old that this insect was credulous about conflagrations, and he had practiced upon its simplicity more than once. A tumble-bug came next, heaving sturdily at its ball, and Tom touched the creature to see it shut its legs against its body and pretend to be dead. The birds were fairly rioting by this time. A catbird, the northern mocker, lit in a tree over Tom's head and trilled out her imitations of her neighbors in a rapture of enjoyment. Then a shrill jay swept down, a flash of blue flame, and stopped on a twig almost within the boy's reach, cocked his head to one side and eyed the strangers with a consuming curiosity. A gray squirrel and a big fellow of the fox kind came scurrying along, sitting up at intervals to inspect and chatter at the boys, for the wild things had probably never seen a human being before and scarcely knew whether to be afraid or not. All nature was wide awake and stirring now. Long lances of sunlight pierced down through the dense foliage far and near, and a few butterflies came fluttering upon the scene. Tom stirred up the other pirates, and they all clattered away with a shout, and in a minute or two were stripped and chasing after and tumbling over each other in the shallow, limpid water of the white sandbar. They felt no longing for the little village sleeping in the distance beyond the majestic waste of water. A vagrant current or a slight rise in the river had carried off their raft, but this only gratified them, since its going was something like burning the bridge between them and civilization. They came back to camp wonderfully refreshed, glad-hearted, and ravenous, and they soon had the campfire blazing up again. Huck found a spring of clear cold water close by, and the boys made cups of broad oak or hickory leaves and felt that water, sweetened with such a wildwood charm as that, would be a good enough substitute for coffee. While Joe was slicing bacon for breakfast, Tom and Huck asked him to hold on a minute. They stepped to a promising nook in the river bank and threw in their lines. Almost immediately they had reward. Joe had not had time to get impatient before they were back again with some handsome bass, a couple of sun perch, and a small catfish, provisions enough for quite a family. They fried the fish with the bacon and were astonished, for no fish had ever seemed so delicious before. They did not know that the quicker a freshwater fish is on the fire after he is caught, the better he is, and they reflected little upon what a sauce, open-air sleeping, open-air exercise, bathing, and a large ingredient of hunger make, too. They lay around in the shade after breakfast, while Huck had a smoke, and then went off through the woods on an exploring expedition. They tramped gaily along, over decaying logs, through tangled underbrush, among solemn monarchs of the forest, hung from their crowns to the ground with a drooping regalia of grapevines. Now and then they came upon snug nooks carpeted with grass and jeweled with flowers. They found plenty of things to be delighted with, but nothing to be astonished at. They discovered that the island was about 3 miles long and a quarter of a mile wide, and that the shore it lay closest to was only separated from it by a narrow channel hardly 200 yards wide. They took a swim about every hour, so it was close upon the middle of the afternoon when they got back to camp. They were too hungry to stop to fish, but they fared sumptuously upon cold ham, and then threw themselves down in the shade to talk. But the talk soon began to drag, and then died. The stillness, the solemnity that brooded in the woods, and the sense of loneliness began to tell upon the spirits of the boys. They fell to thinking. A sort of undefined longing crept upon them. This took dim shape soon. It was budding homesickness. Evening Finn the red-handed was dreaming of his doorsteps and empty hogsheads, but they were all ashamed of their weakness, and none was brave enough to speak his thought. For some time, now, the boys had been dully conscious of a peculiar sound in the distance, just as one sometimes is of the ticking of a clock which he takes no distinct note of. But now this mysterious sound became more pronounced and forced a recognition. The boys started, glanced at each other, and then each assumed a listening attitude. There was a long silence, profound and unbroken. Then a deep, sullen boom came floating down out of the distance. "What is it?" exclaimed Joe under his breath. "I wonder," said Tom in a whisper. "'Tain't thunder," said Huckleberry in an odd tone, "because thunder." "Hark," said Tom. "Listen, don't talk." They waited a time that seemed an age, and then the same muffled boom troubled the solemn hush. "Let's go and see." They sprang to their feet and hurried to the shore toward the town. They parted the bushes on the bank and peered out over the water. The little steam ferryboat was about a mile below the village, drifting with the current. Her broad deck seemed crowded with people. There were a great many skiffs rowing about or floating with the stream in the neighborhood of the ferryboat, but the boys could not determine what the men in them were doing. Soon a great jet of white smoke burst from the ferryboat's side, and as it expanded and rose in a lazy cloud, that same dull throb of sound was borne to the listeners again. "I know now," exclaimed Tom. "Somebody's drownded." "That's it," said Huck. "They done that last summer when Bill Turner got drownded. They shoot a cannon over the water, and that makes him come up to the top. Yes, and they take loaves of bread and put quicksilver in 'em and set 'em afloat, and wherever there's anybody that's drownded, they'll float right there and stop." "Yes, I've heard about that," said Joe. "I wonder what makes the bread do that." "Oh, it ain't the bread, so much," said Tom. "I reckon it's mostly what they say over it before they start it out." "But they don't say anything over it," said Huck. "I've seen 'em and they don't." "Well, that's funny," said Tom. "But maybe they say it to themselves." "Of course they do. Anybody may know that." The other boys agreed that there was reason in what Tom said, because an ignorant lump of bread, uninstructed by an incantation, could not be expected to act very intelligently when set upon an errand of such gravity. "By jings, I wish I was over there now," said Joe. "I do too," said Huck. "I'd give heaps to know who it is." The boys still listened and watched. Soon a revealing thought flashed through Tom's mind, and he exclaimed, "Boys, I know who's drowned. It's us." They felt like heroes in an instant. Here was a gorgeous triumph. They were missed. They were mourned. Hearts were breaking on their account. Tears were being shed, accusing memories of unkindness to these poor, lost lads were rising up, and unavailing regrets and remorse were being indulged. And best of all, the departed were the talk of the whole town, and the envy of all the boys, as far as this dazzling notoriety was concerned. This was fine. It was worth while to be a pirate, after all. As twilight drew on, the ferryboat went back to her accustomed business, and the skiffs disappeared. The pirates returned to camp. They were jubilant with vanity over their new grandeur and the illustrious trouble they were making. They caught fish, cooked supper and ate it, and then fell to guessing at what the village was thinking and saying about them, and the pictures they drew of the public distress on their account were gratifying to look upon from their point of view. But when the shadows of night closed them in, they gradually ceased to talk and sat gazing into the fire, with their minds evidently wandering elsewhere. The excitement was gone now, and Tom and Joe could not keep back thoughts of certain persons at home who were not enjoying this fine frolic as much as they were. Misgivings came. They grew troubled and unhappy. A sigh or two escaped unawares soon. Joe timidly ventured upon a roundabout feeler as to how the others may look upon a return to civilization. "Not right now." But Tom withered him with derision. Huck, being uncommitted as yet, joined in with Tom, and the waver quickly explained and was glad to get out of the scrape with as little taint of chicken-hearted homesickness clinging to his garments as he could. Mutiny was effectually laid to rest for the moment. As the night deepened, Huck began to nod and soon to snore. Joe followed next. Tom lay upon his elbow motionless for some time, watching the two intently. At last he got up cautiously on his knees and went searching among the grass and the flickering reflections flung by the campfire. He picked up and inspected several large semi-cylinders of the thin white bark of a sycamore, and finally chose two which seemed to suit him. Then he knelt by the fire and painfully wrote something upon each of these with his red keel. One he rolled up and put in his jacket pocket, and the other he put in Joe's hat and removed it to a little distance from the owner. Chapter 15. Number 34 and number 27. Dante's passed through all the stages of torture natural to prisoners in suspense. He was sustained at first by that pride of conscious innocence, which is the sequence to hope. Then he began to doubt his own innocence, which justified in some measure the governor's belief in his mental alienation, and then, relaxing his sentiment of pride, he addressed his supplications not to God, but to man. God is always the last resource. Unfortunates who ought to begin with God do not have any hope in him till they have exhausted all other means of deliverance. Dantes asked to be removed from his present dungeon into another, for a change, however disadvantageous, was still a change and would afford him some amusement. He entreated to be allowed to walk about, to have fresh air, books, and writing materials. His requests were not granted, but he went on asking all the same. He accustomed himself to speaking to the new jailer, although the latter was, if possible, more taciturn than the old one. But still, to speak to a man, even though mute, was something. Dantes spoke for the sake of hearing his own voice. He had tried to speak when alone, but the sound of his voice terrified him. Often, before his captivity, Dante's mind had revolted at the idea of assemblages of prisoners made up of thieves, vagabonds, and murderers. He now wished to be amongst them, in order to see some other face. Besides that of his jailer, he sighed for the gallows, with the infamous costume, the chain, and the brand on the shoulder. The gala slaves breathed the fresh air of heaven and saw each other. They were very happy. He besought the jailer one day to let him have a companion, were it evening the mad abb. The jailer, though rough and hardened by the constant sight of so much suffering, was yet a man. At the bottom of his heart he had often had a feeling of pity for this unhappy young man who suffered so, and he laid the request of number 34 before the governor. But the latter sapiently imagined that Dantes wished to conspire or attempt an escape and refused his request. Dantes had exhausted all human resources, and he then turned to God. All the pious ideas that had been so long forgotten returned. He recollected the prayers his mother had taught him, and discovered a new meaning in every word, for in prosperity prayers seem but a mere medley of words, until misfortune comes and the unhappy sufferer first understands the meaning of the sublime language in which he invokes the pity of heaven. He prayed and prayed aloud, no longer terrified at the sound of his own voice, for he fell into a sort of ecstasy. He laid every action of his life before the Almighty, proposed tasks to accomplish, and at the end of every prayer introduced the entreaty, oftener addressed to man than to God: "Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive them that trespass against us." Yet, in spite of his earnest prayers, Dantes remained a prisoner. Then gloom settled heavily upon him. Dantes was a man of great simplicity of thought, and without education. He could not, therefore, in the solitude of his dungeon, traverse in mental vision the history of the ages, bring to life the nations that had perished, and rebuild the ancient cities so vast and stupendous in the light of the imagination, and that pass before the eye glowing with celestial colors in Martin's Babylonian pictures. He could not do this, he whose past life was so short, whose present so melancholy, and his future so doubtful. 19 years of light to reflect upon in eternal darkness. No distraction could come to his aid. His energetic spirit, that would have exulted in thus revisiting the past, was imprisoned like an eagle in a cage. He clung to one idea, that of his happiness, destroyed without apparent cause by an unheard-of fatality. He considered and reconsidered this idea, devoured it, so to speak, as the implacable Ugolino devours the skull of Archbishop Roger in the Inferno of Dante. Rage supplanted religious fervor. Dantes uttered blasphemies that made his jailer recoil with horror, dashed himself furiously against the walls of his prison, wreaked his anger upon everything and chiefly upon himself, so that the least thing, a grain of sand, a straw, or a breath of air that annoyed him, led to paroxysms of fury. Then the letter that Villefort had showed to him recurred to his mind, and every line gleamed forth in fiery letters on the wall like the mean Tekel, a parson of Belshazzar. He told himself that it was the enmity of man, and not the vengeance of heaven, that had thus plunged him into the deepest misery. He consigned his unknown persecutors to the most horrible tortures he could imagine, and found them all insufficient, because after torture came death, and after death, if not repose, at least the boon of a consciousness. By dint of constantly dwelling on the idea that tranquility was death, and if punishment were the end in view, other tortures than death must be invented, he began to reflect on suicide. Unhappy he who, on the brink of misfortune, broods over ideas like these. Before him is a dead sea that stretches in azure calm before the eye. But he who unwarily ventures within its embrace finds himself struggling with a monster that would drag him down to perdition. Once thus ensnared, unless the protecting hand of God snatch him from there, all is over, and his struggles but tend to hasten his destruction. This state of mental anguish is, however, less terrible than the sufferings that precede or the punishment that possibly will follow. There is a sort of consolation at the contemplation of the yawning abyss, at the bottom of which lie darkness and obscurity. Edmund found some solace in these ideas. All his sorrows, all his sufferings, with their train of gloomy spectres, fled from his cell when the angel of death seemed about to enter. Dantes reviewed his past life with composure, and looking forward with terror to his future existence, chose that middle line that seemed to afford him a refuge. Sometimes, said he, in my voyages, when I was a man and commanded other men, I have seen the heavens overcast, the sea rage and foam, the storm arise, and, like a monstrous bird, beating the two horizons with its wings, then I felt that my vessel was a vain refuge, that trembled and shook before the tempest. Soon the fury of the waves and the sight of the sharp rocks announced the approach of death, and death then terrified me, and I used all my skill and intelligence as a man and a sailor to struggle against the wrath of God. But I did so because I was happy, because I had not courted death, because to be cast upon a bed of rocks and seaweed seemed terrible, because I was unwilling that I, a creature made for the service of God, should serve for food to the gulls and ravens. But now it is different. I have lost all that bound me to life. Death smiles and invites me to repose. I die after my own manner. I die exhausted and broken-spirited as I fall asleep when I have paced 3,000 times round my cell. No sooner had this idea taken possession of him than he became more composed, arranged his couch to the best of his power, ate little and slept less, and found existence almost supportable, because he felt that he could throw it off at pleasure, like a worn-out garment. Two methods of self-destruction were at his disposal. He could hang himself with his handkerchief to the window bars, or refuse food and die of starvation. But the first was repugnant to him. Dantes had always entertained the greatest horror of pirates who are hung up to the yardarm. He would not die by what seemed an infamous death. He resolved to adopt the second, and began that day to carry out his resolve. Nearly 4 years had passed away. At the end of the second he had ceased to mark the lapse of time. Dantes said, I wished to die, and had chosen the manner of his death, and fearful of changing his mind, he had taken an oath to die. When my morning and evening meals are brought, thought he, I will cast them out of the window, and they will think that I have eaten them. He kept his word. Twice a day he cast out, through the barred aperture, the provisions his jailer brought him, at first gaily, then with deliberation, and at last with regret. Nothing but the recollection of his oath gave him strength to proceed. Hunger made viands once repugnant, now acceptable. He held the plate in his hand for an hour at a time, and gazed thoughtfully at the morsel of bad meat, of tainted fish, of black and mouldy bread. It was the last yearning for life, contending with the resolution of despair. Then his dungeon seemed less somber, his prospects less desperate. He was still young, he was only 24 or 25. He had nearly 50 years to live. What unforeseen events may not open his prison door, and restore him to liberty? Then he raised to his lips the repast that, like a voluntary Tantalus, he refused himself, but he thought of his oath, and he would not break it. He persisted until, at last, he had not sufficient strength to rise and cast his supper out of the loophole. The next morning he could not see or hear. The jailer feared he was dangerously ill. Edmund hoped he was dying. Thus the day passed away. Edmund felt a sort of stupor creeping over him, which brought with it a feeling almost of content. The gnawing pain at his stomach had ceased, his thirst had abated. When he closed his eyes, he saw myriads of lights dancing before them like the will-o'-the-wisps that play about the marshes. It was the twilight of that mysterious country called Death. Suddenly, about 9 o'clock in the evening, Edmund heard a hollow sound in the wall against which he was lying. So many loathsome animals inhabited the prison that their noise did not, in general, awake him. But whether abstinence had quickened his faculties, or whether the noise was really louder than usual, Edmund raised his head and listened. It was a continual scratching, as if made by a huge claw, a powerful tooth, or some iron instrument attacking the stones. Although weakened, the young man's brain instantly responded to the idea that haunts all prisoners, liberty. It seemed to him that heaven had at length taken pity on him, and had sent this noise to warn him on the very brink of the abyss. Perhaps one of those beloved ones he had so often thought of was thinking of him, and striving to diminish the distance that separated them. No, no, doubtless he was deceived, and it was but one of those dreams that foreign death. Edmund still heard the sound. It lasted nearly 3 hours. He then heard a noise of something falling, and all was silent. Some hours afterwards it began again, nearer and more distinct. Edmund was intensely interested. Suddenly the jailer entered. For a week since he had resolved to die, and during the 4 days that he had been carrying out his purpose, Edmund had not spoken to the attendant, had not answered him when he inquired what was the matter with him, and turned his face to the wall when he looked too curiously at him. But now the jailer may hear the noise and put an end to it, and so destroy a ray of something like hope that soothed his last moments. The jailer brought him his breakfast. Dantes raised himself up and began to talk about everything, about the bad quality of the food, about the coldness of his dungeon, grumbling and complaining, in order to have an excuse for speaking louder, and wearying the patience of his jailer, who out of kindness of heart had brought broth and white bread for his prisoner. Fortunately, he fancied that Dantes was delirious, and placing the food on the rickety table, he withdrew. Edmund listened, and the sound became more and more distinct. There can be no doubt about it, thought he. It is some prisoner who is striving to obtain his freedom. Oh, if I were only there to help him! Suddenly another idea took possession of his mind, so used to misfortune that it was scarcely capable of hope. The idea that the noise was made by workmen the governor had ordered to repair the neighboring dungeon. It was easy to ascertain this, but how could he risk the question? It was easy to call his jailer's attention to the noise and watch his countenance as he listened. But may he not by this means destroy hopes far more important than the short-lived satisfaction of his own curiosity? Unfortunately, Edmund's brain was still so feeble that he could not bend his thoughts to anything in particular. He saw but one means of restoring lucidity and clearness to his judgment. He turned his eyes towards the soup which the jailer had brought, rose, staggered towards it, raised the vessel to his lips, and drank off the contents with a feeling of indescribable pleasure. He had often heard that shipwrecked persons had died through having eagerly devoured too much food. Edmund replaced on the table the bread he was about to devour, and returned to his couch. He did not wish to die. He soon felt that his ideas became again collected. He could think and strengthen his thoughts by reasoning. Then he said to himself, I must put this to the test, but without compromising anybody. If it is a workman, I need but knock against the wall, and he will cease to work, in order to find out who is knocking, and why he does so. But as his occupation is sanctioned by the governor, he will soon resume it. If, on the contrary, it is a prisoner, the noise I make will alarm him. He will cease and not begin again until he thinks every one is asleep. Edmund rose again, but this time his legs did not tremble, and his sight was clear. He went to a corner of his dungeon, detached a stone, and with it knocked against the wall where the sound came. He struck thrice. At the first blow the sound ceased as if by magic. Edmund listened intently. An hour passed. 2 hours passed, and no sound was heard from the wall. All was silent there, full of hope. Edmund swallowed a few mouthfuls of bread and water, and, thanks to the vigor of his constitution, found himself well near recovered. The day passed away in utter silence. Night came without recurrence of the noise. "It is a prisoner," said Edmund joyfully. The night passed in perfect silence. Edmund did not close his eyes. In the morning the jailer brought him fresh provisions. He had already devoured those of the previous day. He ate these, listening anxiously for the sound, walking round and round his cell, shaking the iron bars of the loophole, restoring vigor and agility to his limbs by exercise, and so preparing himself for his future destiny. At intervals he listened to learn if the noise had not begun again, and grew impatient at the prudence of the prisoner, who did not guess he had been disturbed by a captive as anxious for liberty as himself. 3 days passed, 72 long tedious hours which he counted off by minutes. At length one evening, as the jailer was visiting him for the last time that night, Dantes, with his ear for the 100th time at the wall, fancied he heard an almost imperceptible movement among the stones. He moved away, walked up and down his cell to collect his thoughts, and then went back and listened. The matter was no longer doubtful. Something was at work on the other side of the wall. The prisoner had discovered the danger and had substituted a lever for a chisel. Encouraged by this discovery, Edmund determined to assist the indefatigable laborer. He began by moving his bed and looked around for anything with which he could pierce the wall, penetrate the moist cement, and displace a stone. He saw nothing. He had no knife or sharp instrument. The window grating was of iron, but he had too often assured himself of its solidity. All his furniture consisted of a bed, a chair, a table, a pail, and a jug. The bed had iron clamps, but they were screwed to the wood, and it would have required a screwdriver to take them off. The table and chair had nothing. The pail had once possessed a handle, but that had been removed. Dantes had but one resource, which was to break the jug and with one of the sharp fragments attack the wall. He let the jug fall on the floor, and it broke in pieces. Dantes concealed 2 or 3 of the sharpest fragments in his bed, leaving the rest on the floor. The breaking of his jug was too natural an accident to excite suspicion. Edmund had all the night to work in, but in the darkness he could not do much, and he soon felt that he was working against something very hard. He pushed back his bed and waited for day. All night he heard the subterranean workmen, who continued to mine his way. Day came, the jailer entered. Dantes told him that the jug had fallen from his hands while he was drinking, and the jailer went grumblingly to fetch another, without giving himself the trouble to remove the fragments of the broken one. He returned speedily, advised the prisoner to be more careful, and departed. Dantes heard joyfully the key grate in the lock. He listened until the sound of steps died away, and then, hastily displacing his bed, saw, by the faint light that penetrated into his cell, that he had labored uselessly the previous evening in attacking the stone instead of removing the plaster that surrounded it. The damp had rendered it friable, and Dantes was able to break it off in small morsels, it is true, but at the end of half an hour he had scraped off a handful. A mathematician may have calculated that in 2 years, supposing that the rock was not encountered, a passage 20 feet long and 2 feet broad may be formed. The prisoner reproached himself with not having thus employed the hours he had passed in vain hopes, prayer, and despondency. During the 6 years that he had been imprisoned, what may he not have accomplished? In 3 days he had succeeded, with the utmost precaution, in removing the cement and exposing the stonework. The wall was built of rough stones, among which, to give strength to the structure, blocks of hewn stone were at intervals embedded. It was one of these he had uncovered, and which he must remove from its socket. Dantes strove to do this with his nails, but they were too weak. The fragments of the jug broke, and after an hour of useless toil, he paused. Was he to be thus stopped at the beginning, and was he to wait inactive until his fellow workman had completed his task? Suddenly an idea occurred to him. He smiled, and the perspiration dried on his forehead. The jailer always brought Dante's soup in an iron saucepan. This saucepan contained soup for both prisoners, for Dantes had noticed that it was either quite full or half empty, according as the turnkey gave it to him or to his companion first. The handle of this saucepan was of iron. Dantes would have given 10 years of his life in exchange for it. The jailer was accustomed to pour the contents of the saucepan into Dante's plate, and Dantes, after eating his soup with a wooden spoon, washed the plate, which thus served for every day. Now when evening came, Dantes put his plate on the ground near the door. The jailer, as he entered, stepped on it and broke it. This time he could not blame Dantes. He was wrong to leave it there, but the jailer was wrong not to have looked before him. The jailer, therefore, only grumbled. Then he looked about for something to pour the soup into. Dante's entire dinner service consisted of one plate. There was no alternative. "Leave the saucepan," said Dantes. "You can take it away when you bring me my breakfast." This advice was to the jailer's taste, as it spared him the necessity of making another trip. He left the saucepan. Dantes was beside himself with joy. He rapidly devoured his food, and after waiting an hour, lest the jailer should change his mind and return, he removed his bed, took the handle of the saucepan, inserted the point between the hewn stone and rough stones of the wall, and employed it as a lever. A slight oscillation showed Dantes that all went well. At the end of an hour the stone was extricated from the wall, leaving a cavity a foot and a half in diameter. Dantes carefully collected the plaster, carried it into the corner of his cell, and covered it with earth. Then, wishing to make the best use of his time while he had the means of labor, he continued to work without ceasing. At the dawn of day he replaced the stone, pushed his bed against the wall, and lay down. The breakfast consisted of a piece of bread. The jailer entered and placed the bread on the table. "Well, don't you intend to bring me another plate?" said Dantes. "No," replied the turnkey. "You destroy everything. First you break your jug, then you make me break your plate. If all the prisoners followed your example, the government would be ruined. I shall leave you the saucepan and pour your soup into that. So for the future I hope you will not be so destructive." Dantes raised his eyes to heaven and clasped his hands beneath the coverlet. He felt more gratitude for the possession of this piece of iron than he had ever felt for anything. He had noticed, however, that the prisoner on the other side had ceased to labor. No matter, this was a greater reason for proceeding. If his neighbor would not come to him, he would go to his neighbor. All day he toiled on untiringly, and by the evening he had succeeded in extracting 10 handfuls of plaster and fragments of stone. When the hour for his jailer's visit arrived, Dantes straightened the handle of the saucepan as well as he could and placed it in its accustomed place. The turkey poured his ration of soup into it, together with the fish. For thrice a week the prisoners were deprived of meat. This would have been a method of reckoning time had not Dantes long ceased to do so. Having poured out the soup, the turnkey retired. Dantes wished to ascertain whether his neighbor had really ceased to work. He listened. All was silent, as it had been for the last 3 days. Dantes sighed. It was evident that his neighbor distrusted him. However, he toiled on all the night without being discouraged, but after 2 or 3 hours he encountered an obstacle. The iron made no impression, but met with a smooth surface. Dantes touched it and found that it was a beam. This beam crossed, or rather blocked up, the hole Dantes had made. It was necessary, therefore, to dig above or under it. The unhappy young man had not thought of this. "Oh my God," murmured he, "I have so earnestly prayed to you, that I hoped my prayers had been heard. After having deprived me of my liberty, after having deprived me of death, after having recalled me to existence, my God, have pity on me, and do not let me die in despair." "Who talks of God and despair at the same time?" said a voice that seemed to come from beneath the earth, and, deadened by the distance, sounded hollow and sepulchral in the young man's ears. Edmund's hair stood on end, and he rose to his knees. "Ah," said he, "I hear a human voice." Edmund had not heard any one speak save his jailer for 4 or 5 years, and a jailer is no man to a prisoner. He is a living door, a barrier of flesh and blood, adding strength to restraints of oak and iron. "In the name of heaven," cried Dantes, "speak again, though the sound of your voice terrifies me." "Who are you? Who are you?" said the voice. "An unhappy prisoner," replied Dantes, who made no hesitation in answering. "Of what country?" "A Frenchman." "Your name?" "Edmond Dantes." "Your profession?" "A sailor." "How long have you been here?" "Since the 28th of February, 1815. "Your crime?" "I am innocent." "But of what are you accused?" "Of having conspired to aid the Emperor's return." "What, for the Emperor's return?" "The Emperor is no longer on the throne, then. He abdicated at Fontainebleau in 1814, and was sent to the island of Elba." "But how long have you been here that you are ignorant of all this?" "Since 1811." Dantes shuddered. This man had been 4 years longer than himself in prison. "Do not dig any more," said the voice. "Only tell me, how high up is your excavation?" "On a level with the floor." "How is it concealed?" "Behind my bed." "Has your bed been moved since you have been a prisoner?" "No." "What does your chamber open on?" "A corridor." "And the corridor?" "On a court." "Alas!" murmured the voice. "Oh, what is the matter?" cried Dantes. "I have made a mistake owing to an error in my plans. I took the wrong angle, and have come out 15 feet from where I intended. I took the wall you are mining for the outer wall of the fortress, but then you would be close to the sea. That is what I hoped. And supposing you had succeeded, I should have thrown myself into the sea, gained one of the islands near here, the Isle de Dame or the Isle de Tiburon, and then I should have been safe. Could you have swum so far? Heaven would have given me strength, but now all is lost." "All?" "Yes. Stop up your excavation carefully, do not work any more, and wait until you hear from me. Tell me, at least, who you are." I am no 27. "You mistrust me, then," said Dantes. Edmund fancied he heard a bitter laugh resounding from the depths. "Oh, I am a Christian," cried Dantes, guessing instinctively that this man meant to abandon him. "I swear to you by him who died for us that naught shall induce me to breathe one syllable to my jailers, but I conjure you, do not abandon me. If you do, I swear to you, for I have got to the end of my strength, that I will dash my brains out against the wall, and you will have my death to reproach yourself with." "How old are you?" "Your voice is that of a young man." "I do not know my age, for I have not counted the years I have been here. All I do know is that I was just 19 when I was arrested, the 28th of February, 1815. "Not quite 26, murmured the voice. "At that age he cannot be a traitor." "Oh, no, no," cried Dantes. "I swear to you again rather than betray you. I would allow myself to be hacked in pieces. You have done well to speak to me and ask for my assistance, for I was about to form another plan and leave you. But your age reassures me. I will not forget you. Wait, how long? I must calculate our chances. I will give you the signal, but you will not leave me. You will come to me, or you will let me come to you. We will escape, and if we cannot escape, we will talk. You of those whom you love, and I of those whom I love. You must love somebody." "No, I'm alone in the world." "Then you will love me. If you are young, I will be your comrade. If you are old, I will be your son. I have a father who is 70 if he yet lives. I only love him and a young girl called Mercedes. My father has not yet forgotten me, I am sure, but God alone knows if she loves me. Still, I shall love you as I loved my father. It is well, returned the voice. To tomorrow. These few words were uttered with an accent that left no doubt of his sincerity. Dantes rose, dispersed the fragments with the same precaution as before, and pushed his bed back against the wall. He then gave himself up to his happiness. He would no longer be alone. He was perhaps about to regain his liberty. At the worst he would have a companion, and captivity that is shared is but half captivity. Plaints made in common are almost prayers, and prayers, where two or three are gathered together, invoke the mercy of heaven. All day Dantes walked up and down his cell. He sat down occasionally on his bed, pressing his hand on his heart. At the slightest noise he bounded towards the door. Once or twice the thought crossed his mind that he may be separated from this unknown, whom he loved already, and then his mind was made up. When the jailer moved his bed and stooped to examine the opening, he would kill him with his water jug. He would be condemned to die, but he was about to die of grief and despair when this miraculous noise recalled him to life. The jailer came in the evening. Dantes was on his bed. It seemed to him that thus he better guarded the unfinished opening. Doubtless there was a strange expression in his eyes, for the jailer said, "Come, are you going mad again?" Dantes did not answer. He feared that the emotion of his voice would betray him. The jailer went away shaking his head. Night came. Dantes hoped that his neighbor would profit by the silence to address him, but he was mistaken. The next morning, however, just as he removed his bed from the wall, he heard 3 knocks. He threw himself on his knees. "Is it you?" said he. "I am here." "Is your jailer gone?" "Yes," said Dantes. "He will not return until the evening, so that we have 12 hours before us." "I can work, then," said the voice. "Oh, yes, yes, this instant, I entreat you." In a moment that part of the floor on which Dantes was resting his 2 hands as he knelt with his head in the opening suddenly gave way. He drew back smartly, while a mass of stones and earth disappeared in a hole that opened beneath the aperture he himself had formed. Chapter 16. A learned Italian. Seizing in his arms the friend so long and ardently desired, Dantes almost carried him towards the window in order to obtain a better view of his features by the aid of the imperfect light that struggled through the grating. He was a man of small stature, with hair blanched rather by suffering and sorrow than by age. He had a deep-set, penetrating eye, almost buried beneath the thick gray eyebrow, and a long and still black beard reaching down to his breast. His thin face, deeply furrowed by care, and the bold outline of his strongly marked features betokened a man more accustomed to exercise his mental faculties than his physical strength. Large drops of perspiration were now standing on his brow, while the garments that hung about him were so ragged that one could only guess at the pattern upon which they had originally been fashioned. The stranger may have numbered 60 or 65 years, but a certain briskness and appearance of vigor in his movements made it probable that he was aged more from captivity than the course of time. He received the enthusiastic greeting of his young acquaintance with evident pleasure, as though his chilled affections were rekindled and invigorated by his contact with one so warm and ardent. He thanked him with grateful cordiality for his kindly welcome, although he must at that moment have been suffering bitterly to find another dungeon where he had fondly reckoned on discovering a means of regaining his liberty. "Let us first see," said he, "whether it is possible to remove the traces of my entrance here. Our future tranquility depends upon our jailer's being entirely ignorant of it." Advancing to the opening, he stooped and raised the stone easily in spite of its weight. Then, conveying it into its place, he said, "You removed this stone very carelessly, but I suppose you had no tools to aid you." "Why," exclaimed Dantes with astonishment, "do you possess any?" "I made myself some, and with the exception of a file, I have all that are necessary, a chisel, pincers, and lever." "Oh, how I should like to see these products of your industry and patience." "Well, in the first place, here is my chisel." So saying, he displayed a sharp, strong blade with a handle made of beechwood. "And with what did you contrive to make that?" inquired Dantes. "With one of the clamps of my bedstead, and this very tool has sufficed me to hollow out the road by which I came here, a distance of about 50 feet." 50 feet, responded Dantes, almost terrified. "Do not speak so loud, young man, don't speak so loud. It frequently occurs in a state prison like this that persons are stationed outside the doors of the cells purposely to overhear the conversation of the prisoners, but they believe I am shut up alone here. That makes no difference. And you say that you dug your way a distance of 50 feet to get here?" "I do. That is about the distance that separates your chamber from mine. Only, unfortunately, I did not curve aright, for want of the necessary geometrical instruments to calculate my scale of proportion. Instead of taking an ellipsis of 40 feet, I made it 50. I expected, as I told you, to reach the outer wall, pierce through it, and throw myself into the sea. I have, however, kept along the corridor on which your chamber opens, instead of going beneath it. My labor is all in vain, for I find that the corridor looks into a courtyard filled with soldiers." "That's true," said Dantes, "but the corridor you speak of only bounds one side of my cell. There are 3 others. Do you know anything of their situation?" "This one is built against the solid rock, and it would take 10 experienced miners, duly furnished with the requisite tools, as many years to perforate it. This adjoins the lower part of the governor's apartments, and were we to work our way through, we should only get into some lock-up cellars, where we must necessarily be recaptured. The 4th and last side of your cell faces on. Stop a minute, now. Where does it face?" The wall of which he spoke was the one in which was fixed the loophole by which light was admitted to the chamber. This loophole, which gradually diminished in size as it approached the outside to an opening through which a child could not have passed, was for better security furnished with 3 iron bars, so as to quiet all apprehensions evening in the mind of the most suspicious jailer as to the possibility of a prisoner's escape. As the stranger asked the question, he dragged the table beneath the window. "Climb up," said he to Dantes. The young man obeyed, mounted on the table, and, divining the wishes of his companion, placed his back securely against the wall and held out both hands. The stranger, whom as yet Dantes knew only by the number of his cell, sprang up with an agility by no means to be expected in a person of his years, and, light and steady on his feet as a cat or a lizard, climbed from the table to the outstretched hands of Dantes and from them to his shoulders. Then, bending double, for the ceiling of the dungeon prevented him from holding himself erect, he managed to slip his head between the upper bars of the window, so as to be able to command a perfect view from top to bottom. An instant afterwards he hastily drew back his head, saying, "I thought so," and sliding from the shoulders of Dantes as dexterously as he had ascended, he nimbly leaped from the table to the ground. "What was it that you thought?" asked the young man anxiously, in his turn descending from the table. The elder prisoner pondered the matter. "Yes," said he at length, "it is so. This side of your chamber looks out upon a kind of open gallery, where patrols are continually passing, and sentries keep watch day and night." "Are you quite sure of that?" "Certain. I saw the soldier's shape and the top of his musket. That made me draw in my head so quickly, for I was fearful he may also see me." "Well," inquired Dantes, "you perceive then the utter impossibility of escaping through your dungeon?" Then, pursued the young man eagerly, then, answered the elder prisoner, the will of God be done. And, as the old man slowly pronounced those words, an air of profound resignation spread itself over his careworn countenance. Dantes gazed on the man who could thus philosophically resign hopes so long and ardently nourished with an astonishment mingled with admiration. "Tell me, I entreat of you, who and what you are," said he at length. "Never have I met with so remarkable a person as yourself." "Willingly," answered the stranger, "if, truly, you feel any curiosity respecting one now, alas, powerless to aid you in any way. Say not so. You can console and support me by the strength of your own powerful mind. Pray let me know who you really are." The stranger smiled a melancholy smile. "Then listen," said he. "I am the Abbe Faria, and have been imprisoned as you know in this shadow diff since the year 1811, previously to which I had been confined for 3 years in the fortress of Fenestrelle. In the year 1811 I was transferred to Piedmont in France. It was at this period I learned that the destiny which seemed subservient to every wish formed by Napoleon had bestowed on him a son, named King of Rome, evening in his cradle. I was very far then from expecting the change you have just informed me of, namely, that 4 years afterwards this colossus of power would be overthrown. Then who reigns in France at this moment? Napoleon Roman II? No, Louis Roman XVIII, the brother of Louis Roman XVII. How inscrutable are the ways of Providence! For what great and mysterious purpose has it pleased Heaven to abase the man once so elevated, and raise up him who was so abased? Dante's whole attention was riveted on a man who could thus forget his own misfortunes while occupying himself with the destinies of others. "Yes, yes," continued he, "'twill be the same as it was in England. After Charles I. Cromwell, after Cromwell, Charles Roman II, and then James Roman II, and then some son-in-law or relation, some Prince of Orange, a stadtholder who becomes a king. Then new concessions to the people, then a constitution, then liberty." "Ah, my friend," said the abbe, turning towards Dantes and surveying him with the kindling gaze of a prophet, "you are young, you will see all this come to pass. Probably, if ever I get out of prison." "True," replied Feria. "We are prisoners, but I forget this sometimes, and there are evening moments when my mental vision transports me beyond these walls, and I fancy myself at liberty. But therefore are you here? Because in 1807 I dreamed of the very plan Napoleon tried to realize in 1811, because, like Machiavelli, I desired to alter the political face of Italy, and instead of allowing it to be split up into a quantity of petty principalities, each held by some weak or tyrannical ruler, I sought to form one large, compact, and powerful empire. And lastly, because I fancied I had found my Caesar Borgia in a crowned simpleton who feigned to enter into my views only to betray me. It was the plan of Alexander VI and Clement Roman VII, but it will never succeed now, for they attempted it fruitlessly, and Napoleon was unable to complete his work. Italy seems fated to misfortune." And the old man bowed his head. Dantes could not understand a man risking his life for such matters. Napoleon certainly he knew something of, inasmuch as he had seen and spoken with him, but of Clement Roman VII and Alexander VI he knew nothing. "Are you not," he asked, "the priest who here in the shadow diff is generally thought to be ill, mad, you mean, don't you?" "I did not like to say so," answered Dantes, smiling. "Well, then," resumed Feria with a bitter smile, "let me answer your question in full by acknowledging that I am the poor mad prisoner of the Shadow Diff, for many years permitted to amuse the different visitors with what is said to be my insanity, and, in all probability, I should be promoted to the honor of making sport for the children if such innocent beings could be found in an abode devoted like this to suffering and despair." Dantes remained for a short time mute and motionless. At length he said, "Then you abandon all hope of escape? I perceive its utter impossibility, and I consider it impious to attempt that which the Almighty evidently does not approve." "No, Be not discouraged. Would it not be expecting too much to hope to succeed at your first attempt? Why not try to find an opening in another direction from that which has so unfortunately failed? Alas, it shows how little notion you can have of all it has cost me to effect a purpose so unexpectedly frustrated, that you talk of beginning over again. In the first place, I was 4 years making the tools I possess, and have been 2 years scraping and digging out earth hard as granite itself. Then what toil and fatigue has it not been to remove huge stones I should once have deemed impossible to loosen? Whole days have I passed in these titanic efforts, considering my labor well repaid. If, by night time, I had contrived to carry away a square inch of this hard-bound cement, changed by ages into a substance unyielding as the stones themselves, then to conceal the mass of earth and rubbish I dug up, I was compelled to break through a staircase and throw the fruits of my labor into the hollow part of it. But the well is now so completely choked up that I scarcely think it would be possible to add another handful of dust without leading to discovery. Consider also that I fully believed I had accomplished the end and aim of my undertaking, for which I had so exactly husbanded my strength as to make it just hold out to the termination of my enterprise, and now, at the moment when I reckoned upon success, my hopes are forever dashed from me. No, I repeat again, that nothing shall induce me to renew attempts evidently at variance with the Almighty's pleasure. Dantes held down his head, that the other may not see how joy at the thought of having a companion outweighed the sympathy he felt for the failure of the abb's plans. The abbe sank upon Edmund's bed, while Edmund himself remained standing. Escape had never once occurred to him. There are, truly, some things which appear so impossible that the mind does not dwell on them for an instant. To undermine the ground for 50 feet, to devote 3 years to a labor which, if successful, would conduct you to a precipice overhanging the sea, to plunge into the waves from the height of 50, 60, perhaps 100 feet, at the risk of being dashed to pieces against the rocks, should you have been fortunate enough to have escaped the fire of the sentinels, an evening, supposing all these perils past, then to have to swim for your life a distance of at least 3 miles before you could reach the shore, were difficulties so startling and formidable that Dantes had never even dreamed of such a scheme, resigning himself rather to death. But the sight of an old man clinging to life with so desperate a courage gave a fresh turn to his ideas and inspired him with new courage. Another, older and less strong than he, had attempted what he had not had sufficient resolution to undertake, and had failed only because of an error in calculation. This same person, with almost incredible patience and perseverance, had contrived to provide himself with tools requisite for so unparalleled an attempt. Another had done all this. Why, then, was it impossible to Dantes? Feria had dug his way through 50 feet. Dantes would dig 100. Feria, at the age of 50, had devoted 3 years to the task. He, who was but half as old, would sacrifice 6. Feria, a priest and savant, had not shrunk from the idea of risking his life by trying to swim a distance of 3 miles to one of the islands, Dom, Ratonneau, or La Mer. Should a hardy sailor, an experienced diver, like himself, shrink from a similar task? Should he, who had so often for mere amusement's sake plunged to the bottom of the sea to fetch up the bright coral branch, hesitate to entertain the same project? He could do it in an hour, and how many times had he, for pure pastime, continued in the water for more than twice as long? At once Dantes resolved to follow the brave example of his energetic companion, and to remember that what has once been done may be done again. After continuing some time in profound meditation, the young man suddenly exclaimed, "I have found what you were in search of." Feria started. "Have you, truly?" cried he, raising his head with quick anxiety. "Pray, let me know what it is you have discovered." "The corridor through which you have bored your way from the cell you occupy here." extends in the same direction as the outer gallery, does it not? It does, and is not above 15 feet from it. About that. Well, then, I will tell you what we must do. We must pierce through the corridor by forming a side opening about the middle, as it were the top part of a cross. This time you will lay your plans more accurately. We shall get out into the gallery you have described, kill the sentinel who guards it, and make our escape. All we require to ensure success is courage, and that you possess, and strength, which I am not deficient in. As for patience, you have abundantly proved yours. You shall now see me prove mine. One instant, my dear friend, replied the abb. It is clear you do not understand the nature of the courage with which I am endowed, and what use I intend making of my strength. As for patience, I consider that I have abundantly exercised that in beginning every morning the task of the night before, and every night renewing the task of the day. But then, young man, and I pray of you to give me your full attention, then I thought I could not be doing anything displeasing to the Almighty in trying to set an innocent being at liberty, one who had committed no offense and merited not condemnation. And have your notions changed? Asked Dantes with much surprise. Do you think yourself more guilty in making the attempt since you have encountered me? No, neither do I wish to incur guilt. Hitherto I have fancied myself merely waging war against circumstances, not men. I have thought it no sin to bore through a wall or destroy a staircase, but I cannot so easily persuade myself to pierce a heart or take away a life. A slight movement of surprise escaped Dantes. Is it possible, said he, that where your liberty is at stake you can allow any such scruple to deter you from obtaining it? Tell me, replied Feria, what has hindered you from knocking down your jailer with a piece of wood torn from your bedstead, dressing yourself in his clothes, and endeavoring to escape? Simply the fact that the idea never occurred to me, answered Dantes. Because, said the old man, the natural repugnance to the commission of such a crime prevented you from thinking of it, and so it ever is. Because in simple and allowable things our natural instincts keep us from deviating from the strict line of duty. The tiger, whose nature teaches him to delight in shedding blood, needs but the sense of smell to show him when his prey is within his reach, and by following this instinct he is enabled to measure the leap necessary to permit him to spring on his victim. But man, on the contrary, loathes the idea of blood. It is not alone that the laws of social life inspire him with a shrinking dread of taking life. His natural construction and physiological formation. Dantes was confused and silent at this explanation of the thoughts which had unconsciously been working in his mind, or rather soul, for there are two distinct sorts of ideas, those that proceed from the head and those that emanate from the heart. Since my imprisonment, said Feria, I have thought over all the most celebrated cases of escape on record. They have rarely been successful. Those that have been crowned with full success have been long meditated upon and carefully arranged, such, for instance, as the escape of the Duc de Beaufort from the Château de Vincennes, that of the Abbé du Bucoy from for l'évêque of Latude from the Bastille. Then there are those for which chance sometimes affords opportunity, and those are the best of all. Let us, therefore, wait patiently for some favorable moment, and, when it presents itself, profit by it. Ah, said Dantes, you may well endure the tedious delay. You were constantly employed in the task you set yourself, and when weary with toil, you had your hopes to refresh and encourage you. I assure you, replied the old man, I did not turn to that source for recreation or support. What did you do then? I wrote or studied. Were you then permitted the use of pens, ink, and paper? Oh, no, answered the abbé, I had none but what I made for myself. You made paper, pens, and ink? Yes. Dantes gazed with admiration, but he had some difficulty in believing. Feria saw this. When ye pay me a visit in my cell, my young friend, said he, I will show you an entire work, the fruits of the thoughts and reflections of my whole life, many of them meditated over in the shades of the Colosseum, at Rome, at the foot of St. Mark's Column at Venice, and on the borders of the Arno at Florence, little imagining at the time that they would be arranged in order within the walls of the Chateau d'If. The work I speak of is called a treatise on the possibility of a general monarchy in Italy, and will make one large quarto volume. And on what have you written all this? On 2 of my shirts. I invented a preparation that makes linen as smooth and as easy to write on as parchment. You are, then, a chemist? Somewhat. I know Lavoisier, and was the intimate friend of Cabanis. But for such a work you must have needed books. Had you any? I had nearly 5,000 volumes in my library at Rome, but after reading them over many times, I found out that with 150 well-chosen books a man possesses, if not a complete summary of all human knowledge, at least all that a man need really know. I devoted 3 years of my life to reading and studying these 150 volumes, till I knew them nearly by heart, so that since I have been in prison, a very slight effort of memory has enabled me to recall their contents as readily as though the pages were open before me. I could recite you the whole of Thucydides, Xenophon, Plutarch, Titus, Livius, Tacitus, Strada, Jornens, Dante, Montaigne, Shakespeare, Spinoza, Machiavelli, and Bossuet. I name only the most important. You are, doubtless, acquainted with a variety of languages, so as to have been able to read all these. Yes, I speak 5 of the modern tongues, that is to say, German, French, Italian, English, and Spanish. By the aid of ancient Greek I learned modern Greek. I don't speak it so well as I could wish, but I am still trying to improve myself. Improve yourself, repeated Dantes. Why, how can you manage to do so? Why, I made a vocabulary of the words I knew, turned, returned, and arranged them so as to enable me to express my thoughts through their medium. I know nearly 1,000 words, which is all that is absolutely necessary, although I believe there are nearly 100,000 in the dictionaries. I cannot hope to be very fluent, but I certainly should have no difficulty in explaining my wants and wishes, and that would be quite as much as I should ever require. Stronger grew the wonder of Dantes, who almost fancied he had to do with one gifted with supernatural powers, still hoping to find some imperfection which may bring him down to a level with human beings. He added, then if you were not furnished with pens, how did you manage to write the work you speak of? I made myself some excellent ones, which would be universally preferred to all others if once known. You are aware what huge whitings are served to us on maker days. Well, I selected the cartilages of the heads of these fishes, and you can scarcely imagine the delight with which I welcomed the arrival of each Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday, as affording me the means of increasing my stock of pens. For I will freely confess that my historical labors have been my greatest solace and relief. While retracing the past, I forget the present, and traversing at will the path of history, I cease to remember that I am myself a prisoner. But the ink, said Dantes, of what did you make your ink? There was formerly a fireplace in my dungeon, replied Feria, but it was closed up long before I became an occupant of this prison. Still, it must have been many years in use, for it was thickly covered with a coating of soot. This soot I dissolved in a portion of the wine brought to me every Sunday, and I assure you a better ink cannot be desired. For very important notes, for which closer attention is required, I pricked one of my fingers and wrote with my own blood. And when? Asked Dantes. May I see all this? Whenever you please, replied the abb. Oh, then let it be directly, exclaimed the young man. Chapter 17. The Abb's Chamber. after having passed with tolerable ease through the subterranean passage, which, however, did not admit of their holding themselves erect, the two friends reached the further end of the corridor, into which the abb's cell opened. From that point the passage became much narrower, and barely permitted one to creep through on hands and knees. The floor of the abb's cell was paved, and it had been by raising one of the stones in the most obscure corner that Feria had been able to commence the laborious task of which Dantes had witnessed the completion. As he entered the chamber of his friend, Dantes cast around one eager and searching glance in quest of the expected marvels, but nothing more than common met his view. "It is well," said the abb. "We have some hours before us. It is now just 12:15 o'clock. Instinctively Dantes turned round to observe by what watch or clock the abb had been able so accurately to specify the hour. "Look at this ray of light which enters by my window," said the abb, "and then observe the lines traced on the wall. Well, by means of these lines, which are in accordance with the double motion of the earth and the ellipse it describes round the sun, I am enabled to ascertain the precise hour with more minuteness than if I possessed a watch, for that may be broken or deranged in its movements, while the sun and earth never vary in their appointed paths." This last explanation was wholly lost upon Dantes, who had always imagined, from seeing the sun rise from behind the mountains and set in the Mediterranean, that it moved, and not the earth. A double movement of the globe he inhabited, and of which he could feel nothing, appeared to him perfectly impossible. Each word that fell from his companion's lips seemed fraught with the mysteries of science, as worthy of digging out as the gold and diamonds in the mines of Guzerat and Golconda, which he could just recollect having visited during a voyage made in his earliest youth. "Come," said he to the abb, "I am anxious to see your treasures." The abb smiled, and proceeding to the disused fire-base, raised, by the help of his chisel, a long stone, which had doubtless been the hearth, beneath which was a cavity of considerable depth, serving as a safe depository of the articles mentioned to Dantes. "What do you wish to see first?" asked the abb. "Oh, your great work on the monarchy of Italy." Feria then drew forth from his hiding-place 3 or 4 rolls of linen, laid one over the other like folds of papyrus. These rolls consisted of slips of cloth about 4 inches wide and 18 long. They were all carefully numbered and closely covered with writing, so legible that Dantes could easily read it, as well as make out the sense, it being in Italian, a language he, as a Provençal, perfectly understood. "There," said he, "there is the work complete. I wrote the word finis at the end of the 68th strip about a week ago. I have torn up 2 of my shirts and as many handkerchiefs as I was master of to complete the precious pages. Should I ever get out of prison and find in all Italy a printer courageous enough to publish what I have composed, my literary reputation is forever secured." "I see," answered Dantes. "Now let me behold the curious pens with which you have written your work." "Look," said Feria, showing to the young man a slender stick about 6 inches long, and much resembling the size of the handle of a fine painting brush, to the end of which was tied, by a piece of thread, one of those cartilages of which the abb had before spoken to Dantes. It was pointed, and divided at the nib like an ordinary pen. Dantes examined it with intense admiration, then looked around to see the instrument with which it had been shaped so correctly into form. "Ah, yes," said Feria, "the penknife. That's my masterpiece. I made it, as well as this larger knife, out of an old iron candlestick. The penknife was sharp and keen as a razor. As for the other knife, it would serve a double purpose, and with it one could cut and thrust." Dantes examined the various articles shown to him with the same attention that he had bestowed on the curiosities and strange tools exhibited in the shops at Marseilles as the works of the savages in the South Seas from where they had been brought by the different trading vessels. As for the ink, said Feria, I told you how I managed to obtain that, and I only just make it from time to time, as I require it. One thing still puzzles me, observed Dantes, and that is how you managed to do all this by daylight. I worked at night also, replied Feria. Night? Why, for heaven's sake, are your eyes like cats, that you can see to work in the dark? Truly they are not. But God has supplied man with the intelligence that enables him to overcome the limitations of natural conditions. I furnished myself with a light. You did? Pray tell me how. I separated the fat from the meat served to me, melted it, and so made oil. Here is my lamp. So saying, the abb exhibited a sort of torch, very similar to those used in public illuminations. But light? Here are 2 flints and a piece of burnt linen. And matches? I pretended that I had a disorder of the skin and asked for a little sulphur, which was readily supplied. Dantes laid the different things he had been looking at on the table, and stood with his head drooping on his breast, as though overwhelmed by the perseverance and strength of Feria's mind. You have not seen all yet, continued Feria, for I did not think it wise to trust all my treasures in the same hiding place. Let us shut this one up. They put the stone back in its place. The abb sprinkled a little dust over it to conceal the traces of its having been removed, rubbed his foot well on it to make it assume the same appearance as the other, and then, going towards his bed, he removed it from the spot it stood in, behind the head of the bed and concealed by a stone fitting. In so closely as to defy all suspicion was a hollow space, and in this space a ladder of cords between 25 and 30 feet in length. Dantes closely and eagerly examined it. He found it firm, solid, and compact enough to bear any weight. Who supplied you with the materials for making this wonderful work? I tore up several of my shirts and ripped out the seams in the sheets of my bed during my 3 years' imprisonment at Fenestrelle, and when I was removed to the Chateau d'If, I managed to bring the ravelings with me, so that I have been able to finish my work here. And was it not discovered that your sheets were unhemmed? Oh, no, for when I had taken out the thread I required, I hemmed the edges over again. With what? With this needle, said the abb, as opening his ragged vestments he showed Dantes a long, sharp fishbone, with a small perforated eye for the thread, a small portion of which still remained in it. I once thought, continued Feria, of removing these iron bars and letting myself down from the window, which, as you see, is somewhat wider than yours, although I should have enlarged it still more preparatory to my flight. However, I discovered that I should merely have dropped into a sort of inner court, and I therefore renounced the project altogether, as too full of risk and danger. Nevertheless, I carefully preserved my ladder against one of those unforeseen opportunities of which I spoke just now, and which sudden chance frequently brings about. While affecting to be deeply engaged in examining the ladder, the mind of Dantes was in fact busily occupied by the idea that a person so intelligent, ingenious, and clear-sighted as the abb may probably be, able to solve the dark mystery of his own misfortunes, where he himself could see nothing. What are you thinking of? Asked the abb smilingly, imputing the deep abstraction in which his visitor was plunged to the excess of his awe and wonder. I was reflecting, in the first place, replied Dantes, upon the enormous degree of intelligence and ability you must have employed to reach the high perfection to which you have attained. What would you not have accomplished if you had been free? Possibly nothing at all. The overflow of my brain would probably, in a state of freedom, have evaporated in 1,000 follies. Misfortune is needed to bring to light the treasures of the human intellect. Compression is needed to explode gunpowder. Captivity has brought my mental faculties to a focus, and you are well aware that from the collision of clouds electricity is produced, from electricity lightning, from lightning illumination. No, replied Dantes, I know nothing. Some of your words are to me quite empty of meaning. You must be blessed truly to possess the knowledge you have." The abbé smiled. "Well," said he, "but you had another subject for your thoughts. Did you not say so just now?" "I did. You have told me as yet but one of them. Let me hear the other." "It was this, that while you had related to me all the particulars of your past life, you were perfectly unacquainted with mine. Your life, my young friend, has not been of sufficient length to admit of your having passed through any very important events. It has been long enough to inflict on me a great and undeserved misfortune. I would fain fix the source of it on man that I may no longer vent reproaches upon heaven." "Then you profess ignorance of the crime with which you are charged?" "I do, truly, and this I swear by the two beings most dear to me upon earth, my father and Mercedes." "Come," said the abbé, closing his hiding place and pushing the bed back to its original situation, "let me hear your story." Dantes obeyed and commenced what he called his history, but which consisted only of the account of a voyage to India, and 2 or 3 voyages to the Levant, until he arrived at the recital of his last cruise, with the death of Captain Leclerc and the receipt of a packet to be delivered by himself to the Grand Marshal, his interview with that personage, and his receiving, in place of the packet brought, a letter addressed to a Monsieur Noirtier, his arrival at Marseilles, an interview with his father, his affection for Mercedes, and their nuptial feast, his arrest and subsequent examination, his temporary detention at the Palais de Justice, and his final imprisonment in the Château d'If. From this point everything was a blank to Dantes. He knew nothing more, not even the length of time he had been imprisoned. His recital finished, the abbé reflected long and earnestly. "There is," said he, at the end of his meditations, "a clever maxim, which bears upon what I was saying to you some little while ago, and that is that unless wicked ideas take root in a naturally depraved mind, human nature, in a right and wholesome state, revolts at crime, till from an artificial civilization have originated wants, vices, and false tastes, which occasionally become so powerful as to stifle within us all good feelings, and ultimately to lead us into guilt and wickedness." From this view of things, then, comes the axiom that if you visit to discover the author of any bad action, seek first to discover the person to whom the perpetration of that bad action could be in any way advantageous. Now, to apply it in your case, to whom could your disappearance have been serviceable? To no one. By heaven, I was a very insignificant person. Do not speak thus, for your reply evinces neither logic nor philosophy. Everything is relative, my dear young friend, from the king who stands in the way of his successor, to the employee who keeps his rival out of a place. Now, in the event of the king's death, his successor inherits a crown. When the employee dies, the supernumerary steps into his shoes and receives his salary of 12,000 livres. Well, these 12,000 livres are his civil list, and are as essential to him as the 12 millions of a king. Every one, from the highest to the lowest degree, has his place on the social ladder and is beset by stormy passions and conflicting interests, as in Descartes' theory of pressure and impulsion. But these forces increase as we go higher, so that we have a spiral which in defiance of reason rests upon the apex and not on the base. Now let us return to your particular world. You say you were on the point of being made captain of the Pharaon. Yes. And about to become the husband of a young and lovely girl. Yes. Now, could any one have had any interest in preventing the accomplishment of these two things? But let us first settle the question as to its being the interest of any one to hinder you from being captain of the Pharaon. What say you? I cannot believe such was the case. I was generally liked on board, and had the sailors possessed the right of selecting a captain themselves, I feel convinced their choice would have fallen on me. There was only one person among the crew who had any feeling of ill will towards me. I had quarrelled with him some time previously, and had evening challenged him to fight me, but he refused. Now we are getting on. And what was this man's name? Danglars. What rank did he hold on board? He was supercargo. And had you been captain, should you have retained him in his employment? Not if the choice had remained with me, for I had frequently observed inaccuracies in his accounts. Good again. Now then, tell me, was any person present during your last conversation with Captain Leckler? No, we were quite alone. Could your conversation have been overheard by any one? It may, for the cabin door was opened, and stay, now I recollect, Danglars himself passed by just as Captain Leckler was giving me the packet for the Grand Marshal. That's better, cried the Abb. Now we are on the right scent. Did you take anybody with you when you put into the port of Elba? Nobody. Somebody there received your packet and gave you a letter in place of it, I think? Yes, the Grand Marshal did. And what did you do with that letter? Put it into my portfolio. You had your portfolio with you, then? Now, how could a sailor find room in his pocket for a portfolio large enough to contain an official letter? You are right. It was left on board. Then it was not till your return to the ship that you put the letter in the portfolio? No. And what did you do with the same letter while returning from Porto to the vessel? I carried it in my hand, so that when you went on board the Pharaon, everybody could see that. You held a letter in your hand? Yes, Danglars as well as the rest. Danglars as well as others. Now, listen to me, and try to recall every circumstance attending your arrest. Do you recollect the words in which the information against you was formulated? Oh yes, I read it over 3 times, and the words sank deeply into my memory. Repeat it to me. Dantes paused a moment, then said, "This is it, word for word. The king's attorney is informed by a friend to the throne and religion that one Edmond Dantes, mate on board the Pharaon, this day arrived from Smyrna, after having touched at Naples and Porto Ferrajo, has been entrusted by Murat with a packet for the usurper, again, by the usurper, with a letter for the Bonapartist Club in Paris. This proof of his guilt may be procured by his immediate arrest, as the letter will be found, either about his person, at his father's residence, or in his cabin, on board the Pharaon." The Abb shrugged his shoulders. "The thing is clear as day," said he, "and you must have had a very confiding nature, as well as a good heart, not to have suspected the origin of the whole affair. Do you really think so? Ah, that would truly be infamous. How did Danglars usually write? In a handsome, running hand. And how was the anonymous letter written? Backhanded." Again the Abb smiled. "Disguised. It was very boldly written, if disguised." "Stop a bit," said the Abb, taking up what he called his pen, and after dipping it into the ink, he wrote on a piece of prepared linen, with his left hand, the first 2 or 3 words of the accusation. Dantes drew back and gazed on the Abb with a sensation almost amounting to terror. "How very astonishing!" cried he at length. "Why, your writing exactly resembles that of the accusation, simply because that accusation had been written with the left hand, and I have noticed that." "What?" "That while the writing of different persons done with the right hand varies, that performed with the left hand is invariably uniform. You have evidently seen and observed everything. Let us proceed." "Oh, yes, yes. Now as regards the second question." "I am listening." "Was there any person whose interest it was to prevent your marriage with Mercedes?" "Yes, a young man who loved her, and his name was Fernand. That is a Spanish name, I think. He was a Catalan. You imagine him capable of writing the letter?" "Oh, no, he would more likely have got rid of me by sticking a knife into me. That is in strict accordance with the Spanish character. An assassination they will unhesitatingly commit, but an act of cowardice never. Besides," said Dantes, "the various circumstances mentioned in the letter were wholly unknown to him. You had never spoken of them yourself to any one?" "To no one. Not even to your mistress?" "No, Not evening to my betrothed. Then it is Danglars. I feel quite sure of it now. Wait a little. Pray, was Danglars acquainted with Fernand? No, yes, he was. Now I recollect. What? To have seen them both sitting at table together under an arbor at Pier Pamphil's the evening before the day fixed for my wedding. They were in earnest conversation. Danglars was joking in a friendly way, but Fernand looked pale and agitated. Were they alone? There was a third person with them whom I knew perfectly well, and who had, in all probability, made their acquaintance. He was a tailor named Cadros, but he was very drunk. Stay, how strange that it should not have occurred to me before. Now I remember quite well that on the table round which they were sitting were pens, ink, and paper. Oh, the heartless, treacherous scoundrels! Exclaimed Dantes, pressing his hand to his throbbing brows. Is there anything else I can assist you in discovering, besides the villainy of your friends? Inquired the abbe with a laugh. Yes, replied Dantes eagerly. I would beg of you, who see so completely to the depths of things, and to whom the greatest mystery seems but an easy riddle, to explain to me how it was that I underwent no second examination, was never brought to trial, and above all, was condemned without ever having had sentence passed on me. That is altogether a different and more serious matter, responded the abbe. The ways of justice are frequently too dark and mysterious to be easily penetrated. All we have hitherto done in the matter has been child's play. If you wish me to enter upon the more difficult part of the business, you must assist me by the most minute information on every point. Pray ask me whatever questions you please, for, in good truth, you see more clearly into my life than I do myself. In the first place, then, who examined you? The king's attorney, his deputy, or a magistrate? The deputy. Was he young or old? About 6 or 27 years of age, I should say. So, answered the abbe. Old enough to be ambitions, but too young to be corrupt. And how did he treat you? With more of mildness than severity. Did you tell him your whole story? I did. And did his conduct change at all in the course of your examination? He did appear much disturbed when he read the letter that had brought me into this scrape. He seemed quite overcome by my misfortune. By your misfortune? Yes. Then you feel quite sure that it was your misfortune he deplored. He gave me one great proof of his sympathy, at any rate, and that he burnt the sole evidence that could at all have criminated me. What? The accusation? No, the letter. Are you sure? I saw it done. That alters the case. This man may, after all, be a greater scoundrel than you have thought possible. Upon my word, said Dantes, you make me shudder. Is the world filled with tigers and crocodiles? Yes, and remember that two-legged tigers and crocodiles are more dangerous than the others. Never mind, let us go on. With all my heart. You tell me he burned the letter? He did. Saying at the same time, you see I thus destroy the only proof existing against you. This action is somewhat too sublime to be natural. You think so? I am sure of it. To whom was this letter addressed? To M. Noirtier? No. 13 Cock Heron, Paris. Now can you conceive of any interest that your heroic deputy could possibly have had in the destruction of that letter? Why, it is not altogether impossible he may have had, for he made me promise several times never to speak of that letter to any one, assuring me he so advised me for my own interest, and more than this, he insisted on my taking a solemn oath never to utter the name mentioned in the address. Noirtier, repeated the abbe. Noirtier. I knew a person of that name at the court of the Queen of Etruria, and Noirtier, who had been a Girondin during the Revolution. What was your deputy called? De Villefort. The abbe burst into a fit of laughter, while Dantes gazed on him in utter astonishment. What ails you? Said he at length. Do you see that ray of sunlight? I do. Well, the whole thing is more clear to me than that sunbeam is to you. Poor fellow, poor young man. And you tell me this magistrate expressed great sympathy and commiseration for you? He did. And the worthy man destroyed your compromising letter? Yes. And then made you swear never to utter the name of Noirtier? Yes. Why, you poor short-sighted simpleton, can you not guess who this Noirtier was, whose very name he was so careful to keep concealed? Noirtier was his father. Had a thunderbolt fallen at the feet of Dantes, or hell opened its yawning gulf before him, he could not have been more completely transfixed with horror than he was at the sound of these unexpected words. Starting up, he clasped his hands around his head as though to prevent his very brain from bursting, and exclaimed, "His father! His father!" "Yes, his father," replied the abbe. "His right name was Noirtier de Villefort." At this instant a bright light shot through the mind of Dantes and cleared up all that had been dark and obscure before. The change that had come over Villefort during the examination, the destruction of the letter, the exacted promise, the almost supplicating tones of the magistrate, who seemed rather to implore mercy than to pronounce punishment, all returned with a stunning force to his memory. He cried out and staggered against the wall like a drunken man. Then he hurried to the opening that led from the abbe's cell to his own, and said, "I must be alone to think over all this." When he regained his dungeon, he threw himself on his bed, where the turnkey found him in the evening visit, sitting with fixed gaze and contracted features, dumb and motionless as a statue. During these hours of profound meditation, which to him had seemed only minutes, he had formed a fearful resolution, and bound himself to its fulfillment by a solemn oath. Dantes was at length roused from his reverie by the voice of Feria, who, having also been visited by his jailer, had come to invite his fellow-sufferer to share his supper. The reputation of being out of his mind, though harmlessly and evening amusingly so, had procured for the abbe unusual privileges. He was supplied with bread of a finer, whiter quality than the usual prison fare, and evening regaled each Sunday with a small quantity of wine. Now this was a Sunday, and the abbe had come to ask his young companion to share the luxuries with him. Dantes followed. His features were no longer contracted, and now wore their usual expression, but there was that in his whole appearance that bespoke one who had come to a fixed and desperate resolve. Feria bent on him his penetrating eye. "I regret now," said he, "having helped you in your late inquiries, or having given you the information I did." "Why so?" inquired Dantes. "Because it has instilled a new passion in your heart, that of vengeance." Dantes smiled. "Let us talk of something else," said he. Again the abbe looked at him, then mournfully shook his head, but in accordance with Dante's request, he began to speak of other matters. The elder prisoner was one of those persons whose conversation, like that of all who have experienced many trials, contained many useful and important hints as well as sound information, but it was never egotistical, for the unfortunate man never alluded to his own sorrows. Dantes listened with admiring attention to all he said. Some of his remarks corresponded with what he already knew, or applied to the sort of knowledge his nautical life had enabled him to acquire. A part of the good abbe's words, however, were wholly incomprehensible to him, but, like the aurora which guides the navigator in northern latitudes, opened new vistas to the inquiring mind of the listener, and gave fantastic glimpses of new horizons, enabling him justly to estimate the delight an intellectual mind would have in following one so richly gifted as Feria along the heights of truth, where he was so much at home. "You must teach me a small part of what you know," said Dantes, "if only to prevent your growing weary of me. I can well believe that so learned a person as yourself would prefer absolute solitude to being tormented with the company of one as ignorant and uninformed as myself. If you will only agree to my request, I promise you never to mention another word about escaping." The abbe smiled. Alas, my boy, said he, human knowledge is confined within very narrow limits, and when I have taught you mathematics, physics, history, and the 3 or 4 modern languages with which I am acquainted, you will know as much as I do myself. Now, it will scarcely require 2 years for me to communicate to you the stock of learning I possess. 2 years! Exclaimed Dantes. Do you really believe I can acquire all these things in so short a time? Not their application, certainly, but their principles you may. To learn is not to know. There are the learners and the learned. Memory makes the one, philosophy the other. But cannot one learn philosophy? Philosophy cannot be taught. It is the application of the sciences to truth. It is like the golden cloud in which the Messiah went up into heaven. Well, then, said Dantes, what shall you teach me first? I am in a hurry to begin. I want to learn everything, said the abb. And that very evening the prisoners sketched a plan of education to be entered upon the following day. Dantes possessed a prodigious memory, combined with an astonishing quickness and readiness of conception. The mathematical turn of his mind rendered him apt at all kinds of calculation, while his naturally poetical feelings threw a light and pleasing veil over the dry reality of arithmetical computation or the rigid severity of geometry. He already knew Italian, and had also picked up a little of the Ramaic dialect during voyages to the East, and by the aid of these 2 languages he easily comprehended the construction of all the others, so that at the end of 6 months he began to speak Spanish, English, and German. In strict accordance with the promise made to the abb, Dantes spoke no more of escape. Perhaps the delight his studies afforded him left no room for such thoughts. Perhaps the recollection that he had pledged his word on which his sense of honor was keen kept him from referring in any way to the possibilities of flight. Days, evening, months passed by unheeded in one rapid and instructive course. At the end of a year Dantes was a new man. Dantes observed, however, that Feria, in spite of the relief his society afforded, daily grew sadder. One thought seemed incessantly to harass and distract his mind. Sometimes he would fall into long reveries, sigh heavily and involuntarily, then suddenly rise and, with folded arms, begin pacing the confined space of his dungeon. One day he stopped all at once and exclaimed, "Ah, if there were no sentinel, there shall not be one a minute longer than you please," said Dantes, who had followed the working of his thoughts as accurately as though his brain were enclosed in crystal so clear as to display its minutest operations. "I have already told you," answered the abb, "that I loathe the idea of shedding blood. And yet the murder, if you choose to call it so, would be simply a measure of self-preservation. No matter, I could never agree to it. Still, you have thought of it incessantly, alas," cried the abb. "And you have discovered a means of regaining our freedom, have you not?" asked Dantes eagerly. "I have. If it were only possible to place a deaf and blind sentinel in the gallery beyond us." "He shall be both blind and deaf," replied the young man, with an air of determination that made his companion shudder. "No, no," cried the abb, "impossible." Dantes endeavored to renew the subject. The abb shook his head in token of disapproval, and refused to make any further response. 3 months passed away. "Are you strong?" the abb asked one day of Dantes. The young man, in reply, took up the chisel, bent it into the form of a horseshoe, and then as readily straightened it. "And will you engage not to do any harm to the sentry, except as a last resort?" "I promise on my honor." "Then," said the abb, "we may hope to put our design into execution." "And how long shall we be in accomplishing the necessary work?" "At least a year." "And shall we begin at once?" "At once." "We have lost a year to no purpose," cried Dantes. "Do you consider the last 12 months to have been wasted?" asked the abb. "Forgive me," cried Edmund, blushing deeply. "Tut, tut," answered the abb. Man is but man after all, and you are about the best specimen of the genus I have ever known. Come, let me show you my plan. The abb then showed Dantes the sketch he had made for their escape. It consisted of a plan of his own cell and that of Dantes with the passage which united them. In this passage he proposed to drive a level as they do in mines. This level would bring the two prisoners immediately beneath the gallery where the sentry kept watch. Once there, a large excavation would be made, and one of the flagstones with which the gallery was paved be so completely loosened that at the desired moment it would give way beneath the feet of the soldier who, stunned by his fall, would be immediately bound and gagged by Dantes before he had power to offer any resistance. The prisoners were then to make their way through one of the gallery windows and to let themselves down from the outer walls by means of the abb's ladder of cords. Dante's eyes sparkled with joy, and he rubbed his hands with delight at the idea of a plan so simple, yet apparently so certain to succeed. That very day the miners began their labors with a vigor and alacrity proportionate to their long rest from fatigue and their hopes of ultimate success. Nothing interrupted the progress of the work, except the necessity that each was under of returning to his cell in anticipation of the turkey's visits. They had learned to distinguish the almost imperceptible sound of his footsteps as he descended towards their dungeons, and happily never failed of being prepared for his coming. The fresh earth excavated during their present work, and which would have entirely blocked up the old passage, was thrown, by degrees, and with the utmost precaution, out of the window in either Faria's or Dante's cell, the rubbish being first pulverized so finely that the night wind carried it far away without permitting the smallest trace to remain. More than a year had been consumed in this undertaking, the only tools for which had been a chisel, a knife, and a wooden lever. Faria still continuing to instruct Dantes by conversing with him, sometimes in one language, sometimes in another, at others relating to him the history of nations and great men who from time to time have risen to fame and trodden the path of glory. The abb was a man of the world and had, moreover, mixed in the first society of the day. He wore an air of melancholy dignity which Dantes, thanks to the imitative powers bestowed on him by nature, easily acquired, as well as that outward polish and politeness he had before been wanting in, and which is seldom possessed except by those who have been placed in constant intercourse with persons of high birth and breeding. At the end of 15 months the level was finished, and the excavation completed beneath the gallery, and the two workmen could distinctly hear the measured tread of the sentinel as he paced to and fro over their heads, compelled, as they were, to await a night sufficiently dark to favor their flight. They were obliged to defer their final attempt till that auspicious moment should arrive. Their greatest dread now was lest the stone through which the sentry was doomed to fall should give way before its right time, and this they had in some measure provided against by propping it up with a small beam which they had discovered in the walls through which they had worked their way. Dantes was occupied in arranging this piece of wood when he heard Faria, who had remained in Edmund's cell for the purpose of cutting a peg to secure their rope ladder, call to him in a tone indicative of great suffering. Dantes hastened to his dungeon, where he found him standing in the middle of the room, pale as death, his forehead streaming with perspiration, and his hands clinched tightly together. "Gracious heavens!" exclaimed Dantes, "what is the matter? What has happened? Quick, quick!" returned the abb. "Listen to what I have to say." Dantes looked in fear and wonder at the livid countenance of Faria, whose eyes, already dull and sunken, were surrounded by purple circles, while his lips were white as those of a corpse, and his very hair seemed to stand on end. "Tell me, I beseech you, what ails you?" cried Dantes, letting his chisel fall to the floor. Alas, faltered out the Ab, all is over with me. I am seized with a terrible, perhaps mortal illness. I can feel that the paroxysm is fast approaching. I had a similar attack the year previous to my imprisonment. This malady admits but of one remedy. I will tell you what that is. Go into my cell as quickly as you can. Draw out one of the feet that support the bed. You will find it has been hollowed out for the purpose of containing a small phial. You will see they're half filled with a red-looking fluid. Bring it to me, or rather, no, I may be found here. Therefore help me back to my room while I have the strength to drag myself along. Who knows what may happen, or how long the attack may last? In spite of the magnitude of the misfortune which thus suddenly frustrated his hopes, Dantes did not lose his presence of mind, but descended into the passage, dragging his unfortunate companion with him. Then, half carrying, half supporting him, he managed to reach the abb's chamber, when he immediately laid the sufferer on his bed. "Thanks," said the poor abb, shivering as though his veins were filled with ice. "I am about to be seized with a fit of catalepsy. When it comes to its height, I shall probably lie still and motionless as though dead, uttering neither sigh nor groan. On the other hand, the symptoms may be much more violent, and cause me to fall into fearful convulsions, foam at the mouth, and cry out loudly. Take care my cries are not heard, for if they are, it is more than probable I should be removed to another part of the prison, and we be separated forever. When I become quite motionless, cold, and rigid as a corpse, then, and not before, be careful about this. Force open my tass with the knife. Pour from 8 to 10 drops of the liquor contained in the phial down my throat, and I may perhaps revive." "Perhaps," exclaimed Dantes in grief-stricken tones. "Help, help," cried the abb. I die. So sudden and violent was the fit that the unfortunate prisoner was unable to complete the sentence. A violent convulsion shook his whole frame. His eyes started from their sockets. His mouth was drawn on one side. His cheeks became purple. He struggled, foamed, dashed himself about, and uttered the most dreadful cries, which, however, Dantes prevented from being heard by covering his head with the blanket. The fit lasted 2 hours. Then, more helpless than an infant, and colder and paler than marble, more crushed and broken than a reed trampled under foot, he fell back, doubled up in one last convulsion, and became as rigid as a corpse. Edmund waited till life seemed extinct in the body of his friend, then, taking up the knife, he with difficulty forced open the closely fixed jaws, carefully administered the appointed number of drops, and anxiously awaited the result. An hour passed away, and the old man gave no sign of returning animation. Dantes began to fear he had delayed too long before he administered the remedy, and, thrusting his hands into his hair, continued gazing on the lifeless features of his friend. At length, a slight color tinged the livid cheeks. Consciousness returned to the dull, open eyeballs. A faint sigh issued from the lips, and the sufferer made a feeble effort to move. "He is saved! He is saved!" cried Dantes in a paroxysm of delight. The sick man was not yet able to speak, but he pointed with evident anxiety towards the door. Dantes listened and plainly distinguished the approaching steps of the jailer. It was there for near 7 o'clock. But Edmund's anxiety had put all thoughts of time out of his head. The young man sprang to the entrance, darted through it, carefully drawing the stone over the opening, and hurried to his cell. He had scarcely done so before the door opened, and the jailer saw the prisoner seated, as usual, on the side of his bed. Almost before the key had turned in the lock, and before the departing steps of the jailer had died away in the long corridor he had to traverse, Dantes, whose restless anxiety concerning his friend left him no desire to touch the food brought him, hurried back to the abb's chamber, and raising the stone by pressing his head against it, was soon beside the sick man's couch. Feria had now fully regained his consciousness, but he still lay helpless and exhausted. I did not expect to see you again, said he feebly, to Dante's. And why not? Asked the young man. Did you fancy yourself dying? No, I had no such idea, but knowing that all was ready for flight, I thought you may have made your escape. The deep glow of indignation suffused the cheeks of Dante's. Without you? Did you really think me capable of that? At least, said the abb, I now see how wrong such an opinion would have been. Alas, alas, I am fearfully exhausted and debilitated by this attack. Be of good cheer, replied Dantes, your strength will return. And, as he spoke, he seated himself near the bed beside Feria, and took his hands. The abbot shook his head. The last attack I had, said he, lasted but half an hour, and after it, I was hungry, and got up without help. Now I can move neither my right arm nor leg, and my head seems uncomfortable, which shows that there has been a suffusion of blood on the brain. The third attack will either carry me off or leave me paralyzed for life. No, no, cried Dantes, you are mistaken, you will not die. And your third attack, if truly you should have another, will find you at liberty. We shall save you another time, as we have done this, only with a better chance of success, because we shall be able to command every requisite assistance. My good Edmund, answered the abb, be not deceived. The attack which has just passed away condemns me forever to the walls of a prison. None can fly from a dungeon who cannot walk. Well, we will wait a week, a month, 2 months if need be, and meanwhile your strength will return. Everything is in readiness for our flight, and we can select any time we choose. As soon as you feel able to swim, we will go. I shall never swim again, replied Feria. This arm is paralyzed, not for a time, but forever. Lift it and judge if I am mistaken. The young man raised the arm, which fell back by its own weight, perfectly inanimate and helpless. A sigh escaped him. You are convinced now, Edmund, are you not? Asked the abb. Depend upon it, I know what I say. Since the first attack I experienced of this malady, I have continually reflected on it truly. I expected it, for it is a family inheritance. Both my father and grandfather died of it. In a third attack, the physician who prepared for me the remedy I have twice successfully taken was no other than the celebrated Cabanis, and he predicted a similar end for me. The physician may be mistaken, exclaimed Dantes. And as for your poor arm, what difference will that make? I can take you on my shoulders and swim for both of us. My son, said the abb, you, who are a sailor and a swimmer, must know, as well as I do, that a man so loaded would sink before he had done 50 strokes. Cease, then, to allow yourself to be duped by vain hopes that, evening your own excellent heart refuses to believe in. Here I shall remain till the hour of my deliverance arrives, and that, in all human probability, will be the hour of my death. As for you, who are young and active, delay not on my account, but fly, go, I give you back your promise. It is well, said Dantes. Then I shall also remain. Then, rising and extending his hand with an air of solemnity over the old man's head, he slowly added, by the blood of Christ, I swear never to leave you while you live. Feria gazed fondly on his noble-minded, single-hearted, high-principled young friend, and read in his countenance ample confirmation of the sincerity of his devotion and the loyalty of his purpose. Thanks, murmured the invalid, extending one hand. I accept. You may, one of these days, reap the reward of your disinterested devotion. But, as I cannot, and you will not, quit this place, it becomes necessary to fill up the excavation beneath the soldier's gallery. He may, by chance, hear the hollow sound of his footsteps and call the attention of his officer to the circumstance. That would bring about a discovery, which would inevitably lead to our being separated. Go, then, and set about this work, in which, unhappily, I can offer you no assistance. Keep at it all night, if necessary, and do not return here to tomorrow, till after the jailer has visited me. I shall have something of the greatest importance to communicate to you. Dantes took the hand of the abb in his, and affectionately pressed it. Chapter 18. The Treasure. When Dantes returned next morning to the chamber of his companion in captivity, he found Feria seated and looking composed. In the ray of light which entered by the narrow window of his cell, he held open in his left hand, of which alone, it will be recollected, he retained the use, a sheet of paper, which, from being constantly rolled into a small compass, had the form of a cylinder, and was not easily kept open. He did not speak, but showed the paper to Dantes. "What is that?" he inquired. "Look at it," said the abb with a smile. "I have looked at it with all possible attention," said Dantes, "and I only see a half-burnt paper, on which are traces of Gothic characters, inscribed with a peculiar kind of ink. This paper, my friend," said Feria, "I may now avow to you, since I have the proof of your fidelity. This paper is my treasure, of which, from this day forth, one half belongs to you." The sweat started forth on Dante's brow. Until this day, and for how long a time, he had refrained from talking of the treasure, which had brought upon the abb the accusation of madness. With his instinctive delicacy, Edmund had preferred avoiding any touch on this painful chord, and Feria had been equally silent. He had taken the silence of the old man for a return to reason, and now these few words uttered by Feria, after so painful a crisis, seemed to indicate a serious relapse into mental alienation. "Your treasure?" stammered Dantes. Feria smiled. "Yes," said he, "you have, truly, a noble nature, Edmund, and I see, by your paleness and agitation, what is passing in your heart at this moment. No, be assured, I am not mad. This treasure exists, Dantes, and if I have not been allowed to possess it, you will. Yes, few, no one, would listen or believe me, because everyone thought me mad, but you, who must know that I am not, listen to me, and believe me so afterwards, if you will." "Alas," murmured Edmund to himself, "this is a terrible relapse. There was only this blow wanting." Then he said aloud, "My dear friend, your attack has, perhaps, fatigued you. Had you not better repose a while? Tomorrow, if you will, I will hear your narrative, but today I wish to nurse you carefully. Besides," he said, "a treasure is not a thing we need hurry about. On the contrary, it is a matter of the utmost importance." "Edmund," replied the old man, "who knows if tomorrow, or the next day after, the third attack may not come on? And then must not all be over?" "Yes, truly, I have often thought with a bitter joy that these riches, which would make the wealth of a dozen families, will be forever lost to those men who persecute me." This idea was one of vengeance to me, and I tasted it slowly in the night of my dungeon and the despair of my captivity. But now I have forgiven the world for the love of you. Now that I see you young and with a promising future, now that I think of all that may result to you in the good fortune of such a disclosure, I shudder at any delay, and tremble lest I should not assure to one as worthy as yourself the possession of so vast an amount of hidden wealth." Edmund turned away his head with a sigh. "You persist in your incredulity, Edmund," continued Feria. "My words have not convinced you. I see you require proofs. Well, then, read this paper, which I have never shown to any one." "Tomorrow, my dear friend," said Edmund, desirous of not yielding to the old man's madness. "I thought it was understood that we should not talk of that until tomorrow." "Then we will not talk of it until tomorrow, but read this paper today." "I will not irritate him," thought Edmund, and taking the paper, of which half was wanting, having been burnt, no doubt, by some accident, he read, "This treasure, which may amount to of Roman crowns in the most distant A of the second opening WH declare to belong to him a lower. 25th April, 149. Well, said Feria, when the young man had finished reading it. Why, replied Dantes, I see nothing but broken lines and unconnected words, which are rendered illegible by fire. Yes, to you, my friend, who read them for the first time, but not for me, who have grown pale over them by many nights' study, and have reconstructed every phrase, completed every thought. And do you believe you have discovered the hidden meaning? I am sure I have, and you shall judge for yourself. But first listen to the history of this paper. Silence, exclaimed Dantes. Steps approach, I go, adieu, and Dantes, happy to escape the history and explanation which would be sure to confirm his belief in his friend's mental instability, glided like a snake along the narrow passage, while Feria, restored by his alarm to a certain amount of activity, pushed the stone into place with his foot and covered it with a mat in order the more effectually to avoid discovery. It was the governor who, hearing of Feria's illness from the jailer, had come in person to see him. Feria sat up to receive him, avoiding all gestures in order that he may conceal from the governor the paralysis that had already half stricken him with death. His fear was lest the governor, touched with pity, may order him to be removed to better quarters and thus separate him from his young companion. But fortunately this was not the case, and the governor left him, convinced that the poor madman, for whom in his heart he felt a kind of affection, was only troubled with a slight indisposition. During this time, Edmund, seated on his bed with his head in his hands, tried to collect his scattered thoughts. Feria, since their first acquaintance, had been on all points so rational and logical, so wonderfully sagacious, in fact, that he could not understand how so much wisdom on all points could be allied with madness. Was Feria deceived as to his treasure, or was all the world deceived as to Feria? Dantes remained in his cell all day, not daring to return to his friend, thinking thus to defer the moment when he should be convinced, once for all, that the abbe was mad. Such a conviction would be so terrible. But, towards the evening after the hour for the customary visit had gone by, Feria, not seeing the young man appear, tried to move and get over the distance which separated them. Edmund shuddered when he heard the painful efforts which the old man made to drag himself along. His leg was inert, and he could no longer make use of one arm. Edmund was obliged to assist him, for otherwise he would not have been able to enter by the small aperture which led to Dante's chamber. Here I am, pursuing you remorselessly, he said with a benignant smile. You thought to escape my munificence, but it is in vain. Listen to me. Edmund saw there was no escape, and placing the old man on his bed, he seated himself on the stool beside him. You know, said the abbe, that I was the secretary and intimate friend of Cardinal Spada, the last of the princes of that name. I owe to this worthy lord all the happiness I ever knew. He was not rich, although the wealth of his family had passed into a proverb, and I heard the phrase very often, as rich as a Spada. But he, like public rumor, lived on this reputation for wealth. His palace was my paradise. I was tutor to his nephews, who are dead, and when he was alone in the world, I tried, by absolute devotion to his will, to make up to him all he had done for me during 10 years of unremitting kindness. The cardinal's house had no secrets for me. I had often seen my noble patron annotating ancient volumes and eagerly searching amongst dusty family manuscripts. One day, when I was reproaching him for his unavailing searches, and deploring the prostration of mind that followed them, he looked at me, and, smiling bitterly, opened a volume relating to the history of the city of Rome. There, in the 20th chapter of the life of Pope Alexander VI were the following lines, which I can never forget. The great wars of Ramadna had ended. Caesar Borgia, who had completed his conquest, had need of money to purchase all Italy. The The Pope had also need of money to bring matters to an end with Louis Roman XII, King of France, who was formidable still in spite of his recent reverses, and it was necessary, therefore, to have recourse to some profitable scheme, which was a matter of great difficulty in the impoverished condition of exhausted Italy. His Holiness had an idea. He determined to make 2 cardinals, by choosing 2 of the greatest personages of Rome, especially rich men. This was the return the Holy Father looked for. In the first place, he could sell the great appointments and splendid offices which the cardinals already held, and then he had the 2 hats to sell besides. There was a third point in view, which will appear hereafter. The Pope and Caesar Borgia first found the 2 future cardinals. They were Giovanni Rospigliosi, who held 4 of the highest dignities of the Holy See, and Caesar Spada, one of the noblest and richest of the Roman nobility. Both felt the high honor of such a favor from the Pope. They were ambitious, and Caesar Borgia soon found purchasers for their appointments. The result was that Rospigliosi and Spada paid for being cardinals, and 8 other persons paid for the offices the cardinals held before their elevation, and thus 800,000 crowns entered into the coffers of the speculators. It is time now to proceed to the last part of the speculation. The Pope heaped attentions upon Rospigliosi and Spada, conferred upon them the insignia of the cardinalate, and induced them to arrange their affairs and take up their residence at Rome. Then the Pope and Caesar Borgia invited the 2 cardinals to dinner. This was a matter of dispute between the Holy Father and his son. Caesar thought they could make use of one of the means which he always had ready for his friends, that is to say, in the first place, the famous key which was given to certain persons with the request that they go and open a designated cupboard. This key was furnished with a small iron point, a negligence on the part of the locksmith. When this was pressed to effect the opening of the cupboard, of which the lock was difficult, the person was pricked by this small point and died next day. Then there was the ring with the lion's head, which Caesar wore when he wanted to greet his friends with a clasp of the hand. The lion bit the hand thus favored, and at the end of 24 hours the bite was mortal. Caesar proposed to his father that they should either ask the cardinals to open the cupboard or shake hands with them. But Alexander VI replied, "Now as to the worthy cardinals, Spada and Rospigliosi, let us ask both of them to dinner. Something tells me that we shall get that money back. Besides, you forget, Caesar, an indigestion declares itself immediately, while a prick or a bite occasions a delay of a day or 2. Caesar gave way before such cogent reasoning, and the cardinals were consequently invited to dinner. The table was laid in a vineyard belonging to the Pope, near San Pierdarena, a charming retreat which the cardinals knew very well by report. Rospigliosi, quite set up with his new dignities, went with a good appetite and his most ingratiating manner. Spada, a prudent man and greatly attached to his only nephew, a young captain of the highest promise, took paper and pen and made his will. He then sent word to his nephew to wait for him near the vineyard, but it appeared the servant did not find him. Spada knew what these invitations meant, since Christianity, so eminently civilizing, had made progress in Rome. It was no longer a centurion who came from the tyrant with a message, "Caesar wills that you die," but it was a legate, a latter, who came with a smile on his lips to say from the Pope, "His Holiness requests you to dine with him." Spada set out about 2 o'clock to San Pierdarena. The Pope awaited him. The first sight that attracted the eyes of Spada was that of his nephew, in full costume, and Caesar Borgia paying him most marked attentions. Spada turned pale as Caesar looked at him with an ironical air, which proved that he had anticipated all, and that the snare was well spread. They began dinner, and Spada was only able to inquire of his nephew if he had received his message. The nephew replied no, perfectly comprehending the meaning of the question. It was too late, for he had already drunk a glass of excellent wine, placed for him expressly by the Pope's butler. Spada at the same moment saw another bottle approach him, which he was pressed to taste. An hour afterwards a physician declared they were both poisoned through eating mushrooms. Spada died on the threshold of the vineyard. The nephew expired at his own door, making signs which his wife could not comprehend. Then Caesar and the Pope hastened to lay hands on the heritage, under presence of seeking for the papers of the dead man. But the inheritance consisted in this only, a scrap of paper on which Spada had written, I bequeath to my beloved nephew my coffers, my books, and amongst others my breviary with the gold corners, which I beg he will preserve in remembrance of his affectionate uncle. The heir sought everywhere, admired the breviary, laid hands on the furniture, and were greatly astonished that Spada, the rich man, was really the most miserable of uncles. No treasures, unless they were those of science, contained in the library and laboratories. That was all. Caesar and his father searched, examined, scrutinized, but found nothing, or at least very little, not exceeding a few thousand crowns in plate, and about the same in ready money. But the nephew had time to say to his wife before he expired, Look well among my uncle's papers. There is a will. They sought evening more thoroughly than the august heirs had done, but it was fruitless. There were 2 palaces and a vineyard behind the Palatine Hill, but in these days landed property had not much value, and the 2 palaces and the vineyard remained to the family since they were beneath the rapacity of the Pope and his son. Months and years rolled on. Alexander VI died, poisoned, you know by what mistake. Caesar, poisoned at the same time, escaped by shedding his skin like a snake. But the new skin was spotted by the poison till it looked like a tiger's. Then, compelled to quit Rome, he went and got himself obscurely killed in a night skirmish, scarcely noticed in history. After the Pope's death and his son's exile, it was supposed that the Spada family would resume the splendid position they had held before the cardinal's time, but this was not the case. The Spadas remained in doubtful ease. A mystery hung over this dark affair, and the public rumor was that Caesar, a better politician than his father, had carried off from the Pope the fortune of the 2 cardinals. I say the 2 because Cardinal Rospigliosi, who had not taken any precaution, was completely despoiled. Up to this point, said Feria, interrupting the thread of his narrative, this seems to you very meaningless, no doubt, eh? Oh, my friend, cried Dantes, on the contrary, it seems as if I were reading a most interesting narrative. Go on, I beg of you. I will. The family began to get accustomed to their obscurity. Years rolled on, and amongst the descendants some were soldiers, others diplomatists. Some churchmen, some bankers, some grew rich, and some were ruined. I come now to the last of the family, whose secretary I was, the Count of Spada. I had often heard him complain of the disproportion of his rank with his fortune, and I advised him to invest all he had in an annuity. He did so, and thus doubled his income. The celebrated breviary remained in the family and was in the Count's possession. It had been handed down from father to son, for the singular clause of the only will that had been found had caused it to be regarded as a genuine relic, preserved in the family with superstitious veneration. It was an illuminated book with beautiful Gothic characters and so weighty with gold that a servant always carried it before the cardinal on days of great solemnity. At the sight of papers of all sorts, tiles, contracts, parchments, which were kept in the archives of the family, all descending from the poisoned cardinal, I in my turn examined the immense bundles of documents, like 20 servitors, stewards, secretaries before me, but, in spite of the most exhaustive researches, I found nothing. Yet I had evening written a precise history of the Borgia family, for the sole purpose of assuring myself whether any increase of fortune had occurred to them on the death of the Cardinal Caesar Spada, but could only trace the acquisition of the property of the Cardinal Rospigliosi, his companion in misfortune. I was then almost assured that the inheritance had neither profited the Borgias nor the family, but had remained unpossessed like the treasures of the Arabian Nights, which slept in the bosom of the earth under the eyes of the genie. I searched, ransacked, counted, calculated 1,000 and 1,000 times the income and expenditure of the family for 300 years. It was useless. I remained in my ignorance, and the Count of Spada in his poverty. My patron died. He had reserved from his annuity his family papers, his library, composed of 5,000 volumes, and his famous breviary. All these he bequeathed to me, with 1,000 Roman crowns, which he had in ready money, on condition that I would have anniversary masses said for the repose of his soul, and that I would draw up a genealogical tree and history of his house. All this I did scrupulously. Be easy, my dear Edmund, we are near the conclusion. In 1807, a month before I was arrested, and a fortnight after the death of the Count of Spada, on the 25th of December, you will see soon how the date became fixed in my memory. I was reading, for the 1,000th time, the papers I was arranging for the palace was sold to a stranger, and I was going to leave Rome and settle at Florence, intending to take with me 12,000 francs I possessed, my library, and the famous breviary, when, tired with my constant labor at the same thing, and overcome by a heavy dinner I had eaten, my head dropped on my hands, and I fell asleep about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I awoke as the clock was striking 6. I raised my head. I was in utter darkness. I rang for a light, but as no one came, I determined to find one for myself. It was truly but anticipating the simple manners which I should soon be under the necessity of adopting. I took a wax candle in one hand, and with the other groped about for a piece of paper, my matchbox being empty, with which I proposed to get a light from the small flame still playing on the embers. Fearing, however, to make use of any valuable piece of paper, I hesitated for a moment, then recollected that I had seen in the famous breviary, which was on the table beside me, an old paper quite yellow with age, and which had served as a marker for centuries, kept there by the request of the heirs. I felt for it, found it, twisted it up together, and putting it into the expiring flame, set light to it. But beneath my fingers, as if by magic, in proportion as the fire ascended, I saw yellowish characters appear on the paper. I grasped it in my hand, put out the flame as quickly as I could, lighted my taper in the fire itself, and opened the crumpled paper with inexpressible emotion, recognizing, when I had done so, that these characters had been traced in mysterious and sympathetic ink, only appearing when exposed to the fire. Nearly 1/3 of the paper had been consumed by the flame. It was that paper you read this morning. Read it again, Dante's, and then I will complete for you the incomplete words and unconnected sense. Feria, with an air of triumph, offered the paper to Dante's, who this time read the following words, traced with an ink of a reddish color, resembling rust. This 25th day of April, 1498, B. Alexander VI, and fearing that not he may desire to become my heir, and Rian Bentivoglio, who were poisoned my sole heir, that I have Buin has visited with me, that is, in island of Monte Cristo, all I poss jewels, diamonds, gems, that I alone may amount to nearly 2 mil will find on raising the 20s row creek to the east in a right line, 2 open in these caves. The treasure is in the furthest a which treasure I bequeath and leave and as my sole heir. 25th April, 1498. Keys. And now, said the abb, read this other paper, and he presented to Dante's a second leaf with fragments of lines written on it, which Edmund read as follows. Ing invited to dine by his holiness, content with making me pay for my hat, serves for me the fate of Cardinals Caprara. I declare to my nephew, Guido Spada, ride in a place he knows, the caves of the small, est of ingots, gold, money, know of the existence of this treasure, which lions of Roman crowns, and which he ck from the small ings have been made, Angli in the second. Tire to him, our spada. Feria followed him with an excited look, and now, he said, when he saw that Dantes had read the last line, put the two fragments together and judge for yourself. Dantes obeyed, and the conjointed pieces gave the following: this 25th day of April, 1498, being invited to dine by His Holiness Alexander VI, and fearing that not content with making me pay for my hat, he may desire to become my heir, and reserves for me the fate of Cardinals Caprara and Bentivoglio, who were poisoned. I declare to my nephew, Guido Spada, my sole heir, that I have buried in a place he knows and has visited with me, that is, in the caves of the small island of Monte Cristo, all I possess said of ingots, gold, money, jewels, diamonds, gems, that I alone know of the existence of this treasure, which may amount to nearly 2 millions of Roman crowns, and which he will find on raising the 20s Rossi K from the small creek to the east in a right line. 2 openings have been made in these caves. The treasure is in the furthest Angli in the second, which treasure I bequeath and leave entire to him as my sole heir. 25th April, 1498. Gizar Spada. Well, do you comprehend now? Inquired Feria. It is the declaration of Cardinal Spada, and the will so long sought for, replied Edmund, still incredulous. Yes, 1,000 times, yes. And who completed it as it now is? I did. Aided by the remaining fragment, I guessed the rest, measuring the length of the lines by those of the paper, and divining the hidden meaning by means of what was in part revealed, as we are guided in a cavern by the small ray of light above us. And what did you do when you arrived at this conclusion? I resolved to set out, and did set out at that very instant, carrying with me the beginning of my great work, the unity of the Italian kingdom. But for some time the imperial police, who at this period, quite contrary to what Napoleon desired so soon as he had a son born to him, wished for a partition of provinces, had their eyes on me and my hasty departure, the cause of which they were unable to guess. Having aroused their suspicions, I was arrested at the very moment I was leaving Piombino. Now, continued Feria, addressing Dantes with an almost paternal expression, now, my dear fellow, you know as much as I do myself. If we ever escape together, half this treasure is yours. If I die here, and you escape alone, the whole belongs to you. But, inquired Dantes, hesitating, has this treasure no more legitimate possessor in the world than ourselves? No, no. Be easy on that score. The family is extinct. The last Count of Spada, moreover, made me his heir, bequeathing to me this symbolic breviary. He bequeathed to me all it contained. No, no, make your mind satisfied on that point. If we lay hands on this fortune, we may enjoy it without remorse. And you say this treasure amounts to 2 millions of Roman crowns, nearly 13 millions of our money. Asterisk $2, 600, 0 in 1894. Impossible, said Dantes, staggered at the enormous amount. Impossible. And why? Asked the old man. The Spada family was one of the oldest and most powerful families of the 15th century, and in those times, when other opportunities for investment were wanting, such accumulations of gold and jewels were by no means rare. There are at this day Roman families perishing of hunger, though possessed of nearly 1 million in diamonds and jewels handed down by entail, and which they cannot touch. Edmund thought he was in a dream. He wavered between incredulity and joy. I have only kept the secret so long from you, continued Feria, that I may test your character and then surprise you. Had we escaped before my attack of catalepsy, I should have conducted you to Monte Cristo. Now, he added, with a sigh, it is you who will conduct me there. Well, Dantes, you do not thank me? This treasure belongs to you, my dear friend, replied Dantes, and to you only. I have no right to it. I am no relation of yours. You are my son, Dante's, exclaimed the old man. You are the child of my captivity. My profession condemns me to celibacy.